Hi and welcome. This is my re-recording of our QSA Sex and Healthy Relationship Ed event. So my name is X. I also go by Yash. I use all pronouns with a preference for its, am, airs, they, fair, fairs, and he, him, his. I am the Queer Student Alliance at Utah State University's president, and I guess a little background on me and why this is such an interesting topic to me. One, I'm autistic, and human sexuality and sexology in general is my special interest. So I get pretty excited about this stuff. This is basically me info dumping on y'all for 2 hours. But really it connects a lot with like what I want to study. I'm an interdisciplinary studies major, which is the build your own major, and then I'm doing a sexuality studies minor that's basically done at this point. But what I'm really interested in is kind of bringing together more research aspects with more artistic aspects, especially since, so my goals career-wise is to get my PhD so I can do sex research. Once I get my bachelor's here, I want to start my sexuality educator certification, which I'm so excited for. I know lots of wonderful sexuality educators that have given me lots of feedback on like how to go about that. And I want to be a film director because it's really interesting to me to kind of use that as an educational outlet in an entertaining way still, because I think people learn best when they're entertained. And I've done lots of different projects where I've utilized that, especially with my writing. I actually have a banned book that I did kind of a sex ed type of approach with it through a fictional story, and it was really great, really loved it, really sad, working on revamping it, but that's just kind of like some of my work with this topic, and hopefully I'll do more things like this in the future as I learn more and as I achieve more and I get more credentials, things like that. But yeah, no, I also do a lot of sex worker advocacy and also like just like advocacy for survivors as well with some of the work I do. So just forewarning that sexual violence will have brief little touch on here and there throughout this as well. But welcome. This is QSA's LGBTQIA plus inclusive sex and relationship ed. So just a quick preview of the topics that we're going to go over. So I'm going to start by talking about different identities, trying to cover more of the inclusive aspect, like what identities am I including and what do those look like, talking about their experiences. We're going to go into some basic sex ed topics. We're going to talk a little bit about consent and boundaries, about communication because communication is so important, how to find resources. I'm talking a little bit about arousal, about sexual behaviors, about gender affirming sex, which I gave a presentation on a few weeks back for USU's Office of Equity Sex Tourism event, talking about navigating some of the impacts of sexual violence in a relationship, and then, if there's time, which there will be because I'm re-recording this, a little bit about the BDSM, kink, and fetish community. Again, since there might be some triggering topics come up, I mean, different people are triggered by different things. Feel free to definitely mute me or step out if anything comes up, especially with little bits on sexual violence, and also talking about unhealthy or healthy relationships can sometimes be really difficult when we maybe haven't always had the best experiences with those, or maybe recognize things that we didn't realize were unhealthy. So I did just want to start off by talking about the idea that there's no such thing as normal. One thing that my abnormal psychology class talked about when I was way back in concurrent enrollment was that our society kind of defines what's normal and what's abnormal. Those are really constructed things. And so just kind of drawing away that, a lot of these different culture ideals on like normal sex and cultural myths and things like that are not really the standard necessarily, and that there isn't really a such thing as normal sex, and relationships can look like lots of different things, as we'll kind of get into. And I think this is also something that a lot of my favorite sexuality educators have kind of echoed, in that, everyone's experience is normal. There's not necessarily so much anything wrong with anyone. It's just a normal part of our experience. And then also just that everyone's experience is valid. However you navigate your sexuality in a safe, consensual way, and whatever your experience of your sexuality is always valid. So we're going to start by talking about identity, just because we don't want to be putting anyone in a closet. Like, yes, this is meant to be a LGBTQIA plus centered event, but we're not making assumptions about people that they're cisgendered or that they're trans or that people are straight or gay or allo or ace or monoamorous or polyamorous or really any other identity that they have, because regardless of those things, like those experiences are valid. There's so much variety within the community. And, everyone, whether you're like a cishet, like mono, allo individual, or like ace, like homo-romantic, trans, and polyamorous, like those identities are still going to play an impact in your relationships and on your sexual interactions. So getting an understanding of them, getting an understanding of how sometimes we might navigate those differently is so important. And even other identities like your cultural background, your age, your spiritual or political identity, your profession, your ability status, and more are going to intersect with your experience of sexuality and your experience within your relationships. Like for me, like being a third culture kid, being exmo, being pagan, being involved in sex work, those are all things that interact with my relationships and my sexual interactions in ways that it might not for people that even have one identity that's different from mine. So yeah, but know again that everyone's identity, their boundaries, and their choices are always valid. And that, while going through this, like some individuals don't desire to have any kind of sexual relationship or even any kind of relationship. And either way, if people are one or the other or both, like that their experiences are still valid and that that's their choice. So first I want to talk a little bit about biological sex. So one thing that we're starting to understand more through research is that sex is more on a spectrum from like 100% male to 100% female, and most of us are going to kind of land kind of along the spectrum. And there's also intersex identities. Intersex people make up about 2% of the population, so there's still a lot of them, but that can be compiled of lots of different things. It can be like with your chromosomes, like we understand there's more than just XX and XY, but a variety of others. Your hormone levels are going to change, which we all have all 4 of these within us. It just, the amounts we have are going to vary even regardless of your sex. Genitalia can vary. We do have some people born with ambiguous genitalia or somewhere like in between. So it's just really interesting to kind of get an understanding of that. But generally, like if you weren't already familiar with these terms, like your sex assigned at birth is going to be like AMAB or AFAB, so assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth. And that's going to play a lot of a role in how people interact with you, like how they perceive you, things like that. So it gets really interesting. And I think having a good understanding of your body, of yourself, can help you to kind of navigate your sexual experience in a way that you enjoy and that you get a better understanding of yourself. But yeah, sex is on a spectrum, and it's really interesting because we actually all start the same. Like we kind of start in this like gender neutral phase during like, gosh, yeah. But like as hormones and things come in during that pregnancy process, that's when we develop either we're on this female side of things or on this male side of things. There's lots of different things that can happen to interrupt that. And it gets to be really interesting just recognizing that there is like within each of our like bodies, even within our genitalia, there's like a matchup to each thing, even if they've developed differently. Yeah, but overall, so regardless of how you identify, whether you identify as cis or trans or gender non-conforming or not having a gender at all, like we all have some sort of experience with gender or lack of it. So our gender identity is our internal experience of masculinity, femininity, and or otherness. And then our gender expression is then our external experience of how we project these things, as well as like how we perform gender and how other people perceive our gender. And that's just gonna overlap to kind of create what our experience is. And this is gonna vary a lot from person to person, whether even if you are like cisgendered. So gender expression, well, I guess more on gender identity, because I'll get on that next. But some people I really love have talked about it in like the idea of a triangle. Like you still have the spectrum on this binary from like more masculine aligned to more feminine aligned, then also more like off those binary identities. And just people can land anywhere within this, or really outside of it. Like gender is something that we've constructed in a way. So it is just like recognizing that whatever someone's experience is valid. I love this quote. It's from The Pink Line by Mark Griffithser. Everyone has their own gender. There are as many genders in the world as there are people on the planet, which means about 7 billion, as no two people experience masculinity and femininity the same way. We are all our own selves. And I like to add like otherness into that as well, but it's like, again, like everyone's experience is going to be so different. And I feel like even beyond this 7 billion, or really like, well, we're at 8 billion now, is can be even broader than that, because so many people have existed before us, so many people are going to exist. And even then, like as a gender fluid person, my gender changes a lot on a day-to-day basis. So it can be interesting, but obviously this isn't a definitive list of genders. And I'm sorry if you're not included in it, but like we have masculine, feminine, androgynous identities, non-binary identities, different xenogender identities, genderless identities, gender fluid and flux identities, different multi-gendered identities, caste gender, gender queer, etc. For me, like I identify as more masculine aligned generally, but I'm definitely more feminine in how I express myself, which does play a big role in my relationships with how I want my partners to interact with me, how I want them to refer to me. We'll talk more about gender affirming sex later on, but I definitely am a little more like still pangender and genderless within that too. So it is just finding ways to interact within my relationships where I feel seen, where I feel like my experience is euphoric. Yeah. So gender expression doesn't always have to line up with your gender identity. Again, for me, I have a very feminine expression, but I'm definitely more masculine identified. So it's like doesn't always match up. And so sometimes also like the way I might want to be responded to is going to vary as well. But gender expression just involves the way that we express our gender through things like our mannerisms, our dress, our behavior, etc. And you can define your gender expression in lots of different ways, but generally a lot of times we fit it kind of on the scale from masculine to feminine with more androgynous in the middle, just because I feel like these can look like lots of different things for different people. So what I might define as masculine might be feminine for someone else, or it might be nowhere on here, but this is just generally with how we perceive other people's gender expression, what that can look like. This is the Flying Gender Unicorn. I really like this one just because of it shows how much more complexity there is. And I love that it separates how you identify your sexuality from maybe who you're physically attracted to, you're emotionally attracted to. With that, like that can differ still, and you can still like I can identify as aro ace, and I can still find people physically attracted and emotionally attractive, and it doesn't necessarily have to line up in a certain way that I feel like has become a standard. But then also like I love that kind of more physical and emotional attraction are separated, especially since romantic and sexual attraction get connected a lot. The thing I don't like is how some of these, like trying to get more specific with labels, can kind of be a little more exclusive or a little more problematic. So, but there are lots of others of these out there, and you can definitely like if you look up like the gender elephant or the gender like etc. like you'll find something. But I just really like to show kind of all this variety and all the different things that go into it, and just how much individual differences there are. So just about how to have a basic gender affirming interaction, whether with a potential partner or a current partner, or maybe just a friend or anyone you interact with, is one, we don't want to be assuming people's pronouns. Always ask, like, even if you're pretty sure someone's cis, like, it just is better to ask everyone their pronouns, because if we're specifically only asking like trans and gender non-conforming people, we're putting them more on the spot, we're making it less of just a normal thing. And I think like I definitely prefer it, especially when my professors ask everyone to share theirs rather than just asking me, things like that. And even if you like aren't sure, don't want to feel like you're like outing someone or anything, like I feel like one great polite way to do it that I was taught when I was taking human sexuality was like, hey, I use these pronouns. What are yours? Like, just start off by sharing your own. And that also kind of then helps to demonstrate how to go about like saying pronouns for people that are like, what are my pronouns? Like, I've never done this before. So just like demonstrating that, kind of having that mutual interaction, things like that. Um, and then for some people, they want you to ask like with each interaction what they would prefer. So like just like continuing to do so can be nice, or if they have like, oh, just use they them for me, and like I'll tell you if I have others I want to use, like things like that. And I always like to look for like pronoun pins. I try and wear mine around, but it is just kind of a pain sometimes to figure out what pronouns fit. And some days I don't want to necessarily like sit down and really think about it. So it is just depending on different people's preferences. But especially when we're interacting with people and trying to make interactions more gender affirming. Some important things to avoid doing are avoid asking what gender someone identifies as. Like, it doesn't really matter. They're free to share that, but they shouldn't have to come out to you necessarily. Don't ask if someone's received any gender confirmation surgery or anything like that. Don't ask what genitalia someone has, or really anything that would require them to come out. If you don't generally need to know, that's their choice to share that kind of information. And I think especially if you're interested in interacting with someone within a relationship or sexually, like it shouldn't really matter if someone feels like they're only being interacted with or receiving that kind of attention based off of their perceived genitalia or things like that that can just be really dysphoric. So yeah, but especially if you have trans or gender non-conforming partners, like complimenting them, but really for anyone in general, just like again, don't assume what kind of compliments people want. Always ask, like I always like to ask people like, hey, what kind of gendering of compliments are you okay with? Or do you even like compliments? Because some people just don't and like compliments or it can make them uncomfortable. So just asking about what they're comfortable with. Like, and this can be like, do you prefer like more feminine, masculine, or neutral compliments? And even if so, like if you're like, hey, like, is this compliment like feminine gendered for you? Like, what are some examples of things that fit that for you? Because sometimes it can be really hard to not to kind of navigate that if you thought something was gender neutral and it wasn't for someone else. And then especially with like our sexual partners, like naming their bodies, like asking what kind of labels they prefer, if they have their own, like, or if they would just like you to avoid labeling their body and just interact with them without that. So some examples would be like some more like gender neutral terms like chest or genitals, or if people like some of those more like other individualized terms like moobs or gawk or bussy, like things like that that they enjoy and feel affirming, like definitely have those conversations. So just a quick note on transitioning and resources for that. So one, it's always a personal choice to transition. Some individuals choose to, and it's great for them. It's great for their mental health. It's a wonderful experience for them. Other people choose not to, and that's totally okay. That's totally valid. I'm gender fluid, and so transitioning for me would just be then dysphoric on the other end. So it is just like a personal decision on whether or not that's something someone is ready for at the moment, or if they want to do, or if they need it. And yeah, I know especially within the US, one individual interviewed within the Pink Line talks about is like how within the US there's kind of more this need to pick one side of the binary or the other. And it is just like interesting how we don't always necessarily have that space. So it is just recognizing the different ways that this can show up for people based off of their cultural identities as well. If you're a student at USU, the Inclusion Center has some great resources, great people to get in touch with if you are wanting to transition and need some help figuring that out and what your best options are. I know I recently read Becoming a Visible Man by Jameson Green, who's a big trans advocate who's done lots of amazing work, but this is specifically a resource that I'm suggesting for female to male transitions because he has a lot of great information about the transition process for them and talks a lot about like why it is a little more difficult for them to get resources than it might be for some male to female transitioning processes just because of like the different cultural factors and invisibility of trans men. But yeah, another great resource. This is also another area I wanted to bring up, one of the questions that was submitted. So, okay, the question was, my partner is non-binary trans femme, and I'm a lesbian. I'm not sure what to do because I feel like I was more attracted to them when they were taking hormones and when they wear more femme clothes, but I don't want to pressure them into transitioning / doing things they don't feel ready to do. Any recommendations on what I should do? So I'll talk more about this one later when I get into like conflict resolution and things like that. But again, like with this kind of thing, it is always a personal choice to transition. And some people just find it's not for them or it isn't quite gender affirming in the way that they need. And everyone's experience is going to be a little different, regardless of how they identify, even if you're cisgendered. So definitely we don't want to be pressuring anyone to make a decision they're not ready for. But this is definitely something that you can still talk to your partner about, talk about like, okay, maybe how can we navigate this in a way that is going to work for both of us? And we'll talk more about that later. Okay. So now that we've talked a little bit about gender, the other big topic is orientation. So your sexual orientation is like who you're physically attracted to, sexually attracted to, things like that. Like not all kinds of physical attraction to people is inherently sexual. So, but I think one of the big things that's been interesting to talk to people about is your sexual orientation does not define someone's sex drive. Like you can be asexual and absolutely like love sexual interactions, and that can be something you really need. And you can even be like homosexual or heterosexual or bi or any of that and be like just disinterested in sex and maybe not wanting that kind of interaction but still experiencing sexual attraction. So really it isn't a definition of someone's sex drive. I do just like to kind of clarify that. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Your romantic orientation, it doesn't necessarily always line up with your sexual orientation. It's really interesting to talk about them as separate. I know when I was coming out as aromantic, it was interesting for me before that because I assumed that because I was like sexually attracted to people, or at least I was interested in people sexually, that I must experience romantic attraction. And that just wasn't the case for me. Like, that I am still emotionally attracted to people, but just not in a romantic sense. So those don't always have to line up. And you can have like aromantic allosexual people, allosexual ace people, no, alloromantic asexual people, like, and a variety of different things that I'll talk more about in a bit. But like some other ways that can show up too is I've met like homoromantic bisexual individuals, or I know some of that's like panromantic and heterosexual, and it just it can be really interesting to figure out kind of what your experience with that is. And that can definitely play a big impact on your relationships. Like if you are only sexually attracted to women, but you're romantically attracted to people of all sexes and you're in a relationship with a man, like that can be interesting to navigate if they're like, for example, like heterosexual or bisexual, things like that. And then there's also lots of types of tertiary attraction, which is any type of attraction other than like sexual romantic. Sometimes platonic is counted in that as well, but I'll talk more about that in a bit. So your sexual romantic orientation can look like lots of different things. It can be very monosexual or monoromantic, so being attracted just to like one sex or gender. This can be like hetero, so straight, homo, gay, or lesbian. Scolio is used by some individuals to talk about just attraction to gender nonconforming individuals in general, with hetero being like non-binary individuals attracted to other non-binary individuals. or avan being like a binary individual attracted to a non-binary individual, but fully is used more to like expand that to like other identities that aren't necessarily just non-binary. But I know like some people find some of those a little controversial, but I do think whatever label any individual chooses to use is valid, and I'm not in a place myself to judge. And then like multisexual, multi-romantic identities. So this can be like bi, poly, omni, pan, spectra. Talk more about those in just a sec, but that's just being attracted to people of like more than one gender, more than one sex, more than one, like, etc. But I know some people don't really identify with any of these, so like using just the term multisexual to encompass their experience or just maybe not to come out to someone can be a great label. So this is the Kinsey scale. Kinsey has a lot of really interesting work, but I just really like this because it shows that like you can kind of vary on this scale from maybe being strictly heterosexual to strictly homosexual. And some people don't land on this at all, but it is just interesting. I feel like a lot of research really around like hetero and homo identities is really interesting because of how difficult it is for them to find a set definition for homosexuality and heterosexuality, just with how much variability there is for people, with some people that are maybe just slightly attracted to the other as well, or people who have, even if they do identify strictly one way or the other, have previously experimented in heterosexuality or homosexuality or whatever else it might be. So it is just really fascinating. Again, everyone's experience is valid. And then this is a little graphic put together by Polly and Proud. I definitely recommend checking them out. They're a great just social media resource. And it just helps to kind of show some of the differences with multisexuality. So some people will use like the label poly or pan to encompass like being like more attracted to people as the person rather than to their gender. So this is where kind of that idea of like being gender blind comes in. Some people will choose to use poly or bi to kind of encompass not being attracted to all genders, but there are definitely people that use these to say refer to everyone. Like, yeah. And then some people use pan and omni to really encompass that idea. Like I'm 100% attracted to people of all identities, all genders, things like that, just without preference. And then omni and bi sometimes are used to refer to like finding masculinity, femininity, androgyny, etc. attractive just in different ways. I identify as more like omni myself, just because of like that's still playing a role for me, that's still being something that I know like affects me when I'm attracted to people, but I still like experience sexual and emotional and other relationships with people of all gender identities. But there can also be some other skills that can come up for people like being attracted to different gender expressions, from like masculine gender expressions, androgynous, like feminine ones. Like you can land anywhere on that scale, or being more demi or fray. So a little more people are familiar with demi, which is needing a close emotional or some sort of bond with someone in order to experience sexual and or romantic attraction, while fray is a lot more like needing to lack that bond in order to experience that kind of attraction. They can either stay consistent over time or it can like fade as people develop those bonds. So can be really interesting. And then people also on a scale from like A to allo. So this is where your asexual or aromantic identities show up. Allo is people who experience sexual and or romantic attraction. And so just recognizing that rather than on a scale from like asexual to hypersexual, it's actually from asexual to allosexual, because again, your sexual orientation doesn't define your sex drive. Again, another graphic by Polly and Proud, just encompassing aspec identities is like involves all your aromantic, all your asexual identities, as well as other aspec identities in regards to like tertiary attraction would fit under this. But people can be aro and or ace. So aro ace people are both aromantic and asexual, but then you still have, again, aro allo and aro ace individuals. I myself now identify as aro ace, but I did previously identify as aro allo. Just I'll talk a little bit more about that as I talk about some of the upcoming things. But I also like this graphic by them kind of showing some more visibility of the ACE spectrums. Like again, demi people can experience it after a close bond. Asexual is like just includes that entire spectrum, including like demi and gray ace and lots of other aspec identities that I'll go into. And then gray sexual can experience some of these things, but again, sexual interaction does not equal someone's sex drive. But some other orientations are things like just like again the A level gray asexuals, cade sexual or cade romantic, things like that are not experiencing those things due to trauma. Apathy is either being super like romance or sex repulsed and not experiencing any of that attraction. Things like libidoist aces are people that identify as asexual and are sexually satisfied just through like self-stimulation. Other labels like ace spike, ace flux, ace flex. So ace spike is like brief spikes of sexual attraction, but then you also have aver spike, same thing with romantic attraction. Ace flux is like when you fluctuate on a scale on like this is like where aberosexual and aberomantic come in, but fluctuating along the asexual or aromantic spectrum. And then ace flex is kind of an aroflex is fluctuating between like sex averse, sex favorable, romance averse, romance favorable, things like that. And I already talked about demi and furry hostia is needing, usually used with romantic attraction, but it's needing to feel seen and validated and accepted in order to experience things like romantic attraction. Recipro is needing attraction reciprocated in order to experience it. With Luthro, like experiencing things like sexual romantic attraction, but not wanting it reciprocated. Blues and QBO, blues is then enjoying sexual romantic activities and the aesthetic of them in like platonic contents, while QPO is things like not experiencing sexual or romantic attraction, but desiring that kind of relationship. Things like autosexual, autoromantic is attraction to oneself. Abro is kind of more fluid again. Woe is just not being sure what the experience of sexual romantic attraction is, and then queer is just kind of that umbrella term for anything that doesn't fit under those other identities and labels that we have. So yeah, but there's lots more than this. Those are just kind of some of the broader areas that I feel like are covered under this umbrella. But yeah. And I guess there were a few other things I want to talk. Like for some people, they need certain circumstances to experience this attraction. Like sapiosexual is like sapioromantic or attraction to people based off of like intelligence and like just other ways that this can show up. And there's still like ace people that have like sexual fantasies, and there are people that are like sexually romantically only attracted to like fictional characters, or people who even just choose not to label their orientation, which is always valid because a lot of these things it's hard to fit into a box, and having a label can be really important to some people, but for other people it just is something they prefer not to have. But yeah, so this I feel like helps to kind of show like sex favorable to sex adverse, which and like sex positive to sex negative. So this is originally more like how comfortable you are about talking about things like sex, having these kinds of conversations. And then sex favorable to sex averse is more on that scale of like how comfortable you're having that kind of relationship within your interactions. So I'm like a sex positive, sex favorable aro ace individual. So for me, like I think it's really important that we have these conversations. I love having open dialogues about sex. And I really desire sexual interactions within my relationships, even though I don't experience sexual attraction to people. And then identify as more aromance indifferent to romance averse aromantic. So like I can take or leave romantic activities in my relationships. And other times I don't want those in my relationships at all. And I can be a little more like romance neutral, romance indifferent, not really something I want to have lots of conversations about, not something that's a really comfortable topic for me because it is a triggering topic for me. But this is going to vary a lot from person to person, regardless of whether someone is aro or ace. Like you can be completely allosexual, alloromantic, and still kind of fluctuate on this. And then labels like sex repulse and romance repulse again are just being completely repulsed to it, don't want to talk about it, don't want to hear about it, don't want it in my life, things like that. But Yeah, so I had another question that came up that I'll kind of go back to again when we get to that conflict resolution section, but it's I am sex repulsed, asexual. How would I navigate a relationship with an allosexual person? And I so like obviously like your boundaries again are valid. Like you don't have to compromise your disinterest or dislike of any kind of sexual interaction for your partner. So it is just like setting up those boundaries, figuring out how we're going to resolve that, which I'll kind of go into this with some examples in a bit. But this is really going to look a lot different from person to person, even within this situation. So just kind of having a conversation with your partner, kind of discussing boundaries, discussing needs, things like that. Okay. And then so this is tertiary attraction. Again, this is also from Polly and Proud. I really love kind of the way that they showcase these different identities, but kind of this again idea that love doesn't always mean romance. It can be aesthetic attraction, so like finding people aesthetically pleasing to look at. Sensual attractions, like non-sexual physical interactions with people. Platonic attraction, um, even things like altruist is like on that scale between romantic and platonic. Extrema was completely off of that. It's going to vary from person to person. Domestic attraction, so wanting to like live with someone, share household chores, things like that, without necessarily having to be romantic or sexual or any of that. Emotional attraction, I kind of define as just like it can be kind of similar to what people describe with like romantic attraction, but it's not romantic attraction. I don't know. Or platonic, it's always interesting. Social attraction and personal attraction is just kind of like wanting to relate with someone socially, but not have like a friendship or anything with them. Intellectual attraction, noetic attraction is kind of like an apprenticeship like attraction, spiritual attraction, parental attraction from like a parent to a child. Familial attraction is like what you share with like your like blood family or your chosen family or whoever. And then eclectic attraction is really interesting because it's attraction that changes with the state of the relationship. Like for me, with this will be like interacting with someone and knowing that if I were to enter a relationship with this individual, I could develop the kind of attraction to meet that relationship. But it's like I experience platonic attraction when someone decides to create a friendship with me and labels it, or I can develop that kind of emotional and physical attraction if someone asks me out. Or like it's just interesting how that can show up, but then even if like I end a relationship with someone, that attraction can kind of cut down to what it needs to be. So it is really, really interesting some of the different ways that we've been able to label all these different ways we can experience attraction, that it looks like so many different things, and everyone's experience is going to vary. Just so fascinating. Uh, yeah. Okay. Sorry, I had to take a quick break. So now we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the last thing I want to talk about in the identity section, which is person's relationship orientation. So like they're monoamorous, meaning they're like monogamous, or polyamorous, so like engaging in relationships with multiple people, or if they're kind of on that spectrum somewhere and maybe more ambiamorous, which is what I identify as when you're both comfortable within monogamy and within polyamory. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of what this can look like and how it plays a role. So this is another graphic by Polly and Proud. Surprise, surprise, surprise. I really like just kind of showing that, you know, we have a lot more in common. Really regardless of people's gender identity or their sexual orientation or their romantic or other tertiary orientation or how what their relationship structure looks like. We all have so much really in common that there's a lot of overlap, that there really isn't that much different between how we experience relationships, how we experience life, how we experience these different things, other than just what those identities are. So like I really love like even polyamorous, monogamous, those other individuals like still like engage in dating. It still doesn't work for everyone. There's still heartbreak. We're still pursuing mutual relationship goals. There's still emotional vulnerability. It still includes people of all sexes, all gender identities, all orientations, all expressions, it still relies on communication. It still experiences things like jealousy or maybe even romance, depending on someone's experience, things like that. But, you know, we do have a lot in common, which is one of the reasons why a lot of this information is going to be applicable to everyone because there is so much overlap in our relationships and our sexual relationships and things like that. So there are lots of different types of interpersonal relationships we have, like not even just like within this like sexual scene or dating scene or whatever, but even like our relationships with family, people we live with our exes, with acquaintanceships, with friends, maybe like even like best friends, things like that. And some of us are gonna have some or all or different of these relationships. So even like there are so many different types of casual relationships, like strings attached, strings with benefits, comments, etc. So many different types of dating relationships. It could just be going on a date with someone. It could be committed relationship. It could be polyamorous. It could be exclusive. It could be open. It could be queer platonic. It could be a sexual relationship. It could be a romantic relationship. It could be long distance. And a lot of these can show up together as well. Like you can have a sexual relationship in any of these types of relationships, or you can be like queer platonic and polyamorous or in a long distance relationship and any of these other things or things like that. So and then there are also going to be lots of different types of like family structures as well, regardless of whether or not people are like polyamorous. So blended families, like step families, adopted families, single parent households, like those structures can look a lot more different than just the nuclear family, which is really interesting because that's not as common as it is kind of treated. So it is just interesting to kind of look at that and how those structures can differ and how different kind of structures work for different people. And we don't necessarily always choose the structures of our families or our relationships or things like that. So some different types of ethically non-monogamous relationships. And again, any relationship, monogamous, polyamorous, can be done unethically. So and can also be done ethically. So just being aware of that yes, I do use that term, but it's more just because of the kind of just full E&M title. So this like casual relationships can be things like one night stands, no strings attached, fuck buddies, friends with benefits, comment, even like cuddle buddies would tend to be a casual relationship, even if it's not sexual. It is just like not necessarily having a not defining a relationship as committed, which not everyone even chooses to define their relationships, and that's perfectly valid. And you can have like a few or many of these. It just tends to be that like these like culturally ideas of relationships are not necessarily always what everyone needs or wants, and that our relationships can look like lots of different things. So some different types of like polyamorous relationships can be like an open relationship, it can be polygamy, which is what a lot of people tend to think of, I think especially in Utah, but that's not going to be a lot of these different structures, and that can also be done non-consensually in a lot of areas, unfortunately. And things like swinging, things like polyfidelity, which is where like everyone within that polycule is like that's kind of a closed relationship in that sense, but it's still polyamorous, which is interesting. Like relationship anarchy, solo polyamory, which is what I do, where I think kind of like I focus my relationship more on myself, and I do have like partners that I see individually, and maybe like some of them are in relationships where I interact with both partners, right? Interact in like some of these different types of relationships, but it still is kind of that solo polyamory system rather than being like a single individual, because I'm definitely not single. Kitchen table polyamory, like and it just is like the structure of like one person they're dating both, but these two aren't dating. Quads, triads, hierarchical polyamory, parallel polyamory, polycules. I try to practice non-hierarchical polyamory, which for some people can just be treating all partners equally. For me, it tries to be more like treating all my relationships, regardless of the type, equally. So even like friendships are just as important and treated as equally as my relationships. And then kind of that idea that rather than necessarily, I still follow this idea that rather than treating relationships equally, we treat them with equity. So like I'm obviously gonna have different boundaries, different needs, different types of relationships with each of my different interpersonal relationships. But again, it can look like lots of different things. And I do really like this graphic. My boss at the Office of Equity, well, my former boss kind of used this graphic, and I was happy to find it and just kind of like dig into some of these different things and just all these different overlaps and areas that even things that are not ethical, like we still show how like things like cheating can show up. But there can be lots of different overlap for lots of different people. Okay, so before we dive into some of the other topics, I did want to talk a little bit about the relationship escalator at this point. So this idea of like moving up these steps that are kind of presented here, like as we go through our interactions, this image is not mine, by the way, but that we don't necessarily actually have to follow this, which is what I found really interesting when I first came across this concept within the polyamorous community. And just like things like, just because you're married to someone doesn't mean you have to live together with them, things like that. This is obviously gonna like order is gonna vary too based off of like where you're from or like sometimes like the culture there or like your religious beliefs or things like that. But kind of just recognizing that generally culturally these ideas are seen as like, oh, you're more committed if you go up these steps or relationship is more serious. But really we should be navigating our relationships in ways that work for us, and we don't have to think about kind of escalating so much as just what's working in the relationship, what do we want out of it, what do we not, how do we focus on the now rather than kind of what the relationship could be. But yeah, and just like this is just something that regardless of whether you're monoamorous or polyamorous or ambiamorous or identifies anything else, that you're figuring out with your partners what works for you, what you want, what's kind of the goal, and like what works with both of you, things like that. And I think also just thinking about that idea that the length of the relationship defines the success, that not all meaningful relationships last forever. Ever. In fact, most relationships are going to end at some point, even if that's just like through death. But it is just important to remember that however long a relationship lasts doesn't define its success, and relationships end for all sorts of reasons. Like that could be just like unhealthy characteristics. It could be someone's moving. It could be like goals don't align. It can be lots of different things, but there are so many other things we get out of that, like learning how we interact with relationships, what kind of people we click with, what kind of things we want out of relationships, learning more about ourselves, maybe how we navigate conflict, making meaningful memories with people that we care about. That I know for me, it is just avoiding this idea of like choosing to interact with people, even if I know for sure the relationship isn't going to last or isn't going to work out, because I still value my time with those people and they're people that I want to have some sort of relationship with. So, since we've talked a lot about some of these different identities, I think it's important to note that people, how they understand their experiences, their identities can change over time. I've definitely come out a few different times in my life as I've found the vocabulary to describe my experience. And so, kind of like talking about when that process of coming out this little bit is actually taken from my human sexuality textbook, which is Our Sexuality by, gosh, I'll have to find it later and maybe post it in the comment thing underneath the description. But yeah, like in this, so I want to talk a little about coming out, whether to like a friend, family member, partner, or other important people in our lives. So kind of like that internal experience is just like one, acknowledging this new identity, reaching that self-acceptance, and then we're disclosing to other people. Like really, this can look like lots of different things for lots of different people. I know for me, I came out to my family over email, which was good for me because I understood how they would respond. I wanted to give them time to process it before they have their immediate reaction. That was a safe space for me and be able to really explain what I wanted to say without being interrupted. One tip I was given, like obviously this isn't necessarily like everyone's choice, but just kind of an advice I was given was to kind of connect with community and kind of establish that support and that self-confidence in your identity before you come out to family or really major people in your life. Because sometimes when we don't quite have that, it can be really difficult if people don't respond the best way or they question us or kind of question is when problems show up within, like if you come out as polyamorous and your relationships aren't quite working out, like that can be really difficult when the people that you're out to are not supportive or things like that, or just like not having that support system to fall back on. But I do think still, like as I'm learning my identity, there always are some few key people that I do tell right away, even as I'm figuring things out. But Yeah, and then also, like, not everyone's necessarily fully out to their partners, so just kind of being in mind of that and understanding ourselves. And so I did wanna also then talk about, like, when someone comes out to you, like, regardless of whether or not you, like, assume someone is, like, we wanna, again, avoid putting people in a closet regardless of whether or not they're an ally or whether or not they are out as another identity, like, just kind of keeping that in mind, being sensitive to people, paying attention to maybe the things that we say. Remember that no one owes a coming out to you. People don't have to come out to you, regardless of what your relationship is. It's their personal decision to share that information with you. If someone does come out to you, avoid focusing it on you. Avoid like things like, oh, like coming out to someone right after they come out to you because this might be a really big moment for them, or things like if I come out to polyamorous as polyamorous, someone says things like, "Oh, I can never be polyamorous." It's like, I didn't ask you. This is about me, and I'm not necessarily like using this like my relationship or anything. I think just again focusing it on them. We're going to be listening to them. We're going to avoid invalidating their experience. I really love an example from my friend Jenny. She does this like queer FHE group for Mormon identified like queer individuals, and she's very good at accepting first and asking after. So, like a friend of mine came out as ace to her, and she was like so supportive, and then she's like finally like, "What's that?" And just making sure that even if we don't understand someone's identity, even if we have never heard of something, rather than maybe I've never heard of that, like that's not a real thing. Doing things like just like, you know what, I support you, and then I care about you, and then asking questions to kind of understand their experience within that person's boundaries on maybe what they're willing to share, or maybe if they're like, here, you know what, I don't feel comfortable talking about my experience, but I can send you some resources. Like that's something that we can do when we come out to people if they do have questions. And then definitely always say things like, hey, I'm glad you feel comfortable telling me. Because we don't want to necessarily be pushing anyone to come out, but by letting them know that we're glad they feel safe talking to us, that we're glad they're communicating with us, they're glad they feel comfortable doing that can be really big for people. So now we're going to get into our basic sex ed, which I'm going to be talking just like briefly about kind of breaking taboos by having these conversations. And then I'm going to talk about sexual health, contraception, STIs, and lube as some of the more basic topics that I feel like come up. So oftentimes we avoid topics or we censor or have stigmatized some of the most important things for us to be talking about. So just kind of just taking note that, obviously within your own boundaries, like getting a little more comfortable having these conversations, trying not to shame them. Let's be opening dialogues about sex, about our bodies, about sexual violence, about complete menstruation, and social norms built around relationships, normal sex, etc. By kind of like to kind of help to destigmatize and de-shame some of those things. And especially let's try and avoid language that's been created to shame these topics and kind of break down messages that are harmful around them. So like paying attention and like asking like, why is this called this? Why do we not talk about this? Why do we not do this? Kind of engaging in our environment in ways that we can break down these taboos so that some of these conversations can happen more easily. Because I know, especially in Utah, like some people I've talked to have not had any form of sex ed, or things like I know within this last year, or I guess maybe last 2 years, was when they could first talk about consent in sex ed programs at schools here. Or some individuals have shared stories of things like asking a teacher what a condom was, and they can say things like, I can legally say the word condom, but I cannot legally tell you what that is. Like, just how can we kind of open up these dialogues where we do have the power and we are not restricted by these things? And how can we, be kind of trying to break that down, trying to create a more accepting, less stigmatized environment around these topics? So, sexual health, just general thing, get some regular checkups. I know I do like sexual health checkup every year with my doctor. It's really great. If you're a student at USU, you have access to Student Health and Wellness Center. That kind of appointment is completely free to you. I get regular STI testing. This varies a bit for me because I do end up sometimes paying it out of pocket, which at USU it's pretty cheap. My insurance, I generally will bill it to them myself, but it is just like definitely something to get if you can get it like between partners. That's great. If you see little people more frequently, like me, getting it like every 3 months or so is really great as well. So, but yeah, I'll talk more about STIs and STI testing in a bit. And then just like as concerns arise, as you have things that maybe doesn't seem so right. Just talking to your doctor. That's another reason why doing things like self-exams is so important, is so that you can pay attention to your body and then notice when things might be off. So self-exams are things like doing like a breast self-exam where I would like observe my chest for things like lumps, things that seem unusual. And then that can generally help with a lot of things like preventing or getting like early intervention when maybe things like breast cancer or things like that can show up. So just making sure that we're getting those kinds of appointments, because those are things that impact people regardless of their like choice to engage or not engage in sexual interactions. So a bit about contraception. The recommendation for AFABs engaging in any kind of like heterosexual sexual encounters, at least that was according to my when I took human sexuality a few years ago. I'll to update this if that's changed, but it's to use two types of contraception to allow a backup method of birth control. I'm not going to say any type of birth control is better than another. That's a personal thing, and that's always something that you should talk to your doctor about what's going to be best for you. And like, so one of those should be some sort of form of contraception other than condoms. The other form should be condoms because that's the only form of contraception that protects against STIs. So that's just what that recommendation is. And then if you are not engaging in any kind of heterosexual sexual encounter where pregnancy is a concern or where that's not something that you yourself can really take, then definitely use condoms for STI protection and to get your regular STI test, things like that. Um, so a little bit about different options. So things that you would use like every time. So internal condoms, external condoms, and sometimes these are referred to as female and male condoms. Internal condoms just like insert into a vagina, things like that, and then function a lot like an external condom, and these can help to both protect against STIs. Diaphragm would just go over like in that, and cervical cap and sponge would just go over like the cervix. Spermicide generally would still recommend using another form of contraception, but like that would just is a substance that's inserted that then like can kill sperm, things like that. Things that are used on a schedule, so like a shot. Some people that's like if you get it a couple times a year and from a doctor. Some people choose to get this if they're in situations where maybe they don't want their partner to find out that they're on birth control, things like that, and don't have access to healthcare very frequently. Ring changed out every few weeks or so. The patch kind of similar. The pill is kind of what I use, which is just like a daily thing. There's also the mini pill. Um, yeah, definitely things to talk to your doctor about if you're looking into. But these are just kind of showing some of the variety of options. Some more low maintenance things like the implant and like the IUD, which are great. I have lots of people that say great things about both. And then if someone wants something more permanent, there's still other forms of sterilization that you can get. Again, some people that have been like these have worked great, not necessarily 100% effective, but still a great option if that's what someone wants. Again, always talking to your doctor about your lifestyle, your interests, your needs, what is going to work best for you. And then different lifestyle things that can be effective if actually followed are things like abstinence, outer course, like avoiding sexual activities that could lead to impregnation, things like that. I do think it's important to know, like, because I know we have with like some countries where quote unquote virgin births are common, where people engage in sexual behaviors other than penile vaginal intercourse and not necessarily realizing that sometimes things like having like any form of semen in your like the vaginal opening, even if there's no penetration, can and rarely still lead to impregnation. So just being aware of that. And then like fertility awareness methods, things like that. But again, each of these, if truly followed, and then again, still only so much effectiveness. Stuff happens. I do think talking about withdrawal is important, especially since I don't know about you, but I was an avid fan fiction reader as a child, and all those lemons and limes that present withdrawal within sexual interactions is not the best representation because it is ineffective, of course, again, as I kind of mentioned, or with the outer course bit. But yeah, just making sure that we're talking to our doctor about other options if that is something that you're interested in and looking for. Yeah, and then emergency contraception, great. I've used it before. It's a great option, but definitely not something you're going to rely on as your only form of contraception. I believe after a few times it's not really effective anymore, but that's definitely something that you can get an appointment with your doctor if you need it and quickly get access to it. They have it at most pharmacies, so just that's something that's available as well for situations where people maybe were not on any form of birth control, didn't use a condom, things like that, maybe concerned about pregnancy, maybe after experience of sexual violence, things like that. So a little bit more about condoms. So again, these are the only type of contraception that prevent STIs. There's lots of different variety of them, but I do like to note with material, generally latex is standard, most effective. For people not allergic to latex, polyisoprene, like I don't really know how to pronounce that, but I do keep those ones on hand as well because I do have a partner allergic to latex or have had some, so it is just keeping some of those on hand. But a lot of times you can get like free latex condoms at universities and within like different medical care centers. So those are just one of the big standards. Definitely get lubricated ones, they're less likely to break. And if you're adding any kind of lube to condoms, make sure you look at the instructions on it that it's not going to deteriorate latex, things like that, or deteriorate your condoms, things like that, because that can be a problem. And definitely check your expiration dates on your condoms. Please don't store them in things like your wallet or your car or any other like heated space that's going to deteriorate it. So just keeping things like that in mind. If you are a student at USU, you can get free condoms from the Student Health and Wellness Center. You can get them from the Savvy office. The Inclusion Center has some. We're actually most out right now, but there are lots of other places you can get them. And you can also go and buy them at your local like grocery store or pharmacy, things like that. They're available and affordable. So definitely something to check out if you don't know where to get them. So a little bit more about sexually transmitted infections. Again, only condoms prevent STIs and HIV transmission, and even then they might not always be 100% effective, so it's still important to get tested. A lot of times for lots of different STIs, cases can be asymptomatic, so not having any symptoms. And a lot of them can have long incubation periods. They might not always necessarily be detected right away or noticed or picked up through STI testing, especially if you recently get an STI and you are getting like a STI test the next day, it might not necessarily detect that. So making sure that we're getting tested regularly. I use the Student Health and Wellness Center right now. I've also had people go to Planned Parenthoods to get them before. How frequently, again, like if you can get them between partners, it's always great. Otherwise, I know my doctor generally recommends like once a year. I see a lot of people, so like once every 3 months is generally more my preferred. So I don't have to reach out to a ton of people if I test positive on a year. So yeah, just paying attention to that. If you do test positive for an STI, please, please, please tell your partners, any partners you've had, like if you have any form of contact information for them, definitely reach out, let them know, get them your first and last name and date of birth so they can get free STI testing, so that they can get tested and not continue to spread that. But definitely let them know. Like I know a lot of times there's lots of STI shaming and shaming people with AIDS or HIV or etc. So making sure that we are telling people when we test positive. There are lots of treatments. Plenty of STIs can be like completely cured. Others you can work around them. You can get them down to an area where they are not transferable to other people, even if someone has AIDS, like medication for that can make it now so that it's can get down to a low enough count that they can't transfer it to someone else. So just being aware and definitely communicating that with people before a sexual interaction if you do have one is so important. Or even if you've tested positive and are waiting for it to clear up or treated and are waiting to retest, like it's always an important part that someone is consenting to a sexual interaction and aware of that. in advance, which can be really tricky, really difficult when there is so much shaming of people with STIs, but just again, we still want to be communicating that with people. And if someone discloses to us that they have an STI, that we are responding to them in positive ways, that we're not shaming them, because like just treating them the same way we would treat anyone else who is sick in any other way, and yeah, helping to get them the resources that they need. So a little bit about lube, because it is just a fun and big aspect of sexual interactions at this point. You can use lube for like any kind of penetration, any like kind of massage, for like masturbation, for lots of different things. Please only use lube that was made to be used as lube. Don't get out your Cool Whip, don't get out your lotion. Like if it wasn't meant to be used as lube, don't use it as such. Go and buy like actual lube. There's lots of great brands from either like your local sex shop, from things like Spencer's, from like you can order some online, you can find some at your grocery store sometimes. If you have a reaction to a type of lube, definitely don't use it again. And there are lots of different types. There's water-based, there's silicone lube, there's oil-based lube, there's anal-specific lube. Definitely like if you have questions like at a local sex shop or like at Spencer's here, like you can generally like ask like, hey, like this is kind of what I need. What do you recommend? Or things like does this work with like my silicone toys, things like that. You can do your own research, but they're like generally well educated. They've been given training on those topics. And so definitely like just asking them questions. Also like looking at the pH of lube. So like I use a different lube for like vaginal things and versus anal things, because the vaginal pH and the anal pH are going to be different. And so having lube that is meant to match up with that and meant to be safer for those uses is really big. So now we're going to talk a little bit about healthy relationships, navigating just relationships in general. So with my work, we use this thing called like the relationship spectrum, where relationships on a spectrum from healthy to abusive, because you can be in a healthy relationship and still have a few unhealthy characteristics. Obviously, like that can get to a point where even a really unhealthy relationship can have a couple healthy characteristics, but an abusive relationship is never going to be healthy. And that can look like lots of different things. I'll talk about that in a sec. So some like healthy relationship characteristics can be things like having some like autonomy within the relationship, having trust, open communication, respect for each other. Unhealthy relationship characteristics can be things like, you know, apologizing but not changing someone's behavior, or like stonewalling someone, or it can be like covert punishment, like withholding affection if you're pissed at someone, or barf bag intimacy, or kind of like doing things for your partner to avoid conflict, or like criticizing someone. And a lot of unhealthy behaviors might be better worked on outside of a relationship, in truth. So sometimes relationships just have to take a pause to work on some of those things. The main difference between unhealthy and abusive relationships is unhealthy characteristics hurt the relationship, while abusive characteristics hurt an individual. So abuse can be physical, it can be sexual, it can be verbal, it can be controlling someone's access to their own money or to education. It can be reproductive, so things like tampering with someone's birth control, taking off a condom during sex. Um, it can be gaslighting someone, it can be controlling behavior, but it can look like lots and lots of different things, like even just like guilt tripping someone, or like saying things like, oh, well, if you love me, you would do this, or like just like some different things that get into abusive behaviors. What an abusive relationship looks like is generally there's like this honeymoon phase where everything's great, there's lots of love bombing, there's like this like just like everything's just like over the top amazing. And there's kind of this walking on eggshells phase where there's lots of tension, then there's an outburst of violence, a promise to never do it again, and then like back into that honeymoon phase. And it just kind of goes into this cycle. And it can be really difficult for individuals when this relationship can be so grand and so amazing, the best thing they've ever had, but then also have these terrible violent episodes. and you get kind of caught up in this idea that, oh, but they can change, and it can get really difficult for people to get out of that. So it's so important for us to be patient with these individuals to kind of try and understand their situation without forcing different choices on them, but still kind of offering resources where we can. So one question that I actually got in person for this little event was just asking like what to do if your friend is in an unhealthy relationship, like just like you can do, I'll talk about perception checking in a bit, but things like, hey, I noticed like maybe these behaviors in your relationship, like these are kind of like unhealthy, like how can I maybe help to support you, like what does this really look like for you? Just like trying not to force anyone to make decisions about the relationships, but just like kind of putting some things out, being like, hey, I noticed this. I noticed that this is a little unhealthy. Like, would you like some help? Like, what can I do to support you? How can I help you navigate this? Things like that. So now we're going to talk a little bit about consent and boundaries. So consent here at USU is defined as an affirmative agreement to do the same thing at the same time in the same way. And so consent is going to apply to everything that we have boundaries around, which are not just going to be sexual. It's going to include like our belongings. It's going to include like our time, what we want to talk about, our sense of physical space, like technology, like lots of different things. And consent can be communicated verbally and non-verbally. So like you can communicate through your nonverbal behavior that you're consenting, or you can kind of use that to kind of read people. And like that can get to be a fine line, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. And if you aren't sure, if you're struggling to read someone, you can always ask, like, hey, is this okay with you? But we're still using reading those nonverbal cues to make sure that even if someone's saying like yes, that they actually mean it. Things like I don't know or maybe don't imply consent. If someone expresses uncertainty anyway, you stop. It means no. Like just leave it be. Just because you're in a relationship with someone doesn't automatically mean have consent, and consent can always be withdrawn at any time. So even if it seems like, oh, we've already gone so far within this interaction, you always have the right to withdraw your consent if you don't consent to something anymore. So asking for consent, always be specific, just like being very clear about what it is that you're getting consent for so that people are fully informed. We want to be paying really close attention to people's nonverbal cues. So some things like if someone says no, or if they pull away, or if they're not reciprocating a behavior, if they're frowning, or if they say things like not today, maybe later, I don't really like that, like that can mean that they're disinterested. Or if someone is like says like yes, or I'd love to, or they're initiating the contact, or they're like nodding, or they're like if someone's like holding their arms out for a hug, like that would be like consenting to a hug, or someone's like reciprocating the behavior, that can be signs of consent. But again, if you aren't sure, you can always ask people. Even if you like are like don't necessarily mean no, but aren't interested in something, you can always offer alternatives. So like if someone's like giving consent, they can be like, you know what, this isn't cool with me, but I would be open to doing this instead, or but this is okay with me, things like that, having that open dialogue. So some examples of asking for consent could be things like, hey, is it okay if I touch you like this? Or I really would like to try this. What are your thoughts? Or can I do blank, etc. And you can always respond with things like, yes, I'd love to, or like, do you want to try this? Things like that. So just a quick note on sexual violence. I do like to note that anyone, regardless of their sex assigned at birth, their gender identity or expression, their orientation, their race, ethnicity, age, profession, ability status, etc., any other identity can be a victim, just as anyone can be a perpetrator of sexual violence. And it's so important to recognize that everyone's experience within that is valid. Well, unfortunately, those identities can affect how people are responded to within those situations. Also, abuse can look a lot different for different people based on their identities. I know I gave different examples, but that can also look like things like having devices withheld from a disabled partner, or having threats to out an LGBTQIA plus partner. It can look like so many different things. Um, yeah. And then any sexual encounter where something is happening without a person's consent is assault. So any aspect of that, if someone's in a sexual encounter and they don't consent to something, it is assault. And regardless of what that is, that person's experience is completely valid. And I do just like to clarify that just because of, unfortunately, people that have shared experiences with me where they were not sure if they could label their experience as such when it definitely is. Also, coercion is not consent. If someone is coerced into saying yes through things like intimidation, through a power imbalance, through this relationship, it is not consent because consent and coercion cannot coexist together. Pressuring can get really close into coercion if you are pressuring a partner to do something they don't really want to, even if it isn't in a coercive way. That still can be really unhealthy and really problematic. And it is just like, respect your partner, respect whatever their boundaries on something are. So boundaries and rules. So boundaries are things that like kind of they control your behavior and how others can respectfully interact with you. While rules then are kind of mutual and voluntary agreements that we have another person about, like our collective behavior that kind of then can get into controlling other people's behavior, but it is consensual, it is mutual, it is agreed on. So rules would be things like if you would have rules about cheating within your relationship, and that does include your boundaries, but it also includes some level of rules when it starts to control other people's behaviors. So there are lots of different types of boundaries. Boundaries can be physical, which is like your sense of space or touch. So like if you're not a big hugger, that's a physical boundary. Sexual boundaries can be like topics you debate with people, such as not wanting to debate religion or politics with people. Emotional boundaries can be things like not letting someone trauma dump on you in a moment. Material boundaries involve like your possessions, your finances. Sexual boundaries is anything around sexual activity or whether or not you even choose to engage in sexual activity. And then technological boundaries include things like who has access to your location or like you have screen time limits on your phone. That's a technological boundary. And time is like the use of your time, things like that. Like what are your boundaries around that? But people's boundaries can change and grow over time, and they should be revisited, especially within our relationships. But overall, boundaries should never control how another person should act. And they're going to change a lot depending on who we're interacting with and where we're interacting. So, like, I'm going to have different boundaries with, like, a partner of mine than I am with, like, one of my classmates. Or, like, me and a friend of mine are going to have different boundaries depending on whether we're interacting with them at home or another setting. And that could just be, like, because different things are going to vary. Like, if I have a boundary someone has to take their shoes off in my home, that's not going to apply when we're like out on public transit. Or like some of the topics we might talk about or might vary. Like there might be things that I'm comfortable with in my own home, but I don't want to talk about in public. But yeah, and then you shouldn't have to explain your boundaries to someone in order for them to respect them. Like that's your choice. No is a complete sentence. So again, 100% your choice to explain that or not. But I'm going to take a quick break. Okay, so when we're talking about boundaries, some different ways that we can share boundaries are things like, just so you know, I don't like this, or I prefer to like it when people do this. Or if someone has crossed a boundary, you could be like, hey, can we talk about when you did this? Or like, hey, this is okay with me long as you don't do blank. Like, I know a lot of times when people ask me boundaries, it can be really broad and difficult. So I do generally like, if you're asking about boundaries, be specific. And I'll be like, oh, well, this is generally okay with me. I just have a few boundaries around these particular things when it comes to this particular activity, which can be really tricky when you're laying lots of boundaries out, which is why I generally like recommend just talking about boundaries like at different times in smaller bits rather than just like dumping a whole list on people because that can be really overwhelming, really difficult to process, and a real struggle to try and remember and meet all those boundaries. So just having open dialogue, hey, just so you remember, like this isn't okay with me, or like things like that as it comes up, or like, hey, I'm glad you really remembered that I prefer this or I like this, things like that. When we're asking about boundaries, again, be specific. That could be just like, hey, what are your boundaries around this specific thing? Or is this okay with you? Things like that. Okay. So the other thing that comes up with navigating consent and boundaries is setting safe words. So safe words are basically just like words that you use to like let someone know like, hey, this is kind of getting out of bounds or this is crossing a boundary, things like that. And it doesn't just have to be for sex or for BDSM because the BDSM community is where we kind of got this concept of a safe word where that kind of started. And really they're great. Like they're like kind of like the center of where the idea of consent comes from. So just like, but this could be just navigating your relationships. Like if someone says something dysphoric or triggering, or like, hey, this is kind of getting out of my like emotional bounds or intellectual boundaries, things like that. Like having that safe word there to kind of just be like, hey, like let's stop this for a second. Let's have a conversation about this, things like that. Your safe word should be 1 to 2 words max. So something that's easy to say, like mayo, is one I like because it just is kind of similar to the Mandarin word for no, which I used some growing up. So it is just like one of those like words I'm not necessarily going to use with my English speaking friends, but I just like throw it out there and it's just like this could be like the safe word if we've discussed and said that that is a safe word. It's something that isn't going to be said super often, so it's not like, is that the safe word or is that just you saying that word we use all the time? It shouldn't be no, because like that's not always the most like attentive, and sometimes like people unfortunately within our culture we're taught like no means yes and things like that, and it just gets really tricky. And you should also have a nonverbal safe word in case like people who can't communicate verbally or they can't hear each other or things like that. So especially like going into a situation where I know that a verbal safe word probably isn't going to be very effective or be able to be utilized, trying to set nonverbal like, hey, I'll tap you 3 times or things like that. That again isn't something you're going to do a ton, but it is just going to like let them know. One of the big ones, especially that's used within the BDSM community, is the stoplight. So like you might just like say red is like a hard stop, like we have to immediately stop what we're doing. Yellow could be like, okay, this is getting out of bounds, like maybe that means slow down, we have a conversation. Maybe that means like, okay, avoid this thing. Green can just be like, yeah, this is great, which can be another thing you can have a safe word for without necessarily being super like direct about it if that's something that's getting uncomfortable. So this is a 3-step approach to saying no that was in my human sexuality textbook when I was still kind of not comfortable enough with boundaries. So one, people say no in a variety of different ways. Like I already mentioned some before, like, hey, like maybe later, or not right now, or that's not something I enjoy, things like that. But a 3-step approach just for like general scenarios that you can practice is just like one, expressing appreciation for the invitation, saying no really clearly, and then maybe offering an alternative. So if I find concerts really overstimulating for me, I could be like, hey, and my friend asked me to come to one with them, and be like, hey, I'm really glad that you invited me. That's not something that I'm interested in doing, but I'm free to hang out with you beforehand if you want. Like we can go get food, things like that. Like finding a way to kind of, appreciate the thought, obviously if someone's navigating this conversation politely, and then make it really clear that you mean no, and then definitely offer alternatives if you can, like, or if you're just like, you know what, I'm not interested in interacting with you, like just being really clear and be like stating like what you are comfortable with, so that it kind of can sometimes be a little easier for people to process. So now we're going to talk a lot about communication, because communication is such a key part of healthy relationships in general. So we're talking about it like within our interpersonal relationships, within sex, and within conflict. So yeah. So one thing that I find is really important is talking about defining your relationships. So like discussing with like a partner or friend or whoever, like what does this kind of relationship structure look like for you within relationships? Is this going to be a more casual interaction, or is this going to be committed? Is it going to be an exclusive or an open relationship? Like what exactly does this structure look like for you? Some people choose not to label their relationships, and that's perfectly valid. And if that works for you, that's great. For me, that can get really tricky trying to figure out how I want to navigate a relationship with someone. So having those labels is important to me, especially with collecting attraction, when that is going to fluctuate based off of the label of the relationship. So it can get interesting. And definitely talk with your partner about what your needs are, what your wants are, what your expectations are within that relationship. So needs could be like, what is it that you need in the relationship to help you feel secure and cared for? Obviously, this can't necessarily start to really like go into controlling behavior, but just talk about like what kinds of things do you need out of the relationship that you're looking for. Maybe those line up, maybe those, like, as long as they don't cross that person's boundaries, like those can be valid and important communication tips. I'm like, okay, and if you aren't sure how to navigate that, you talk it through. I'll talk about that with like conflict resolution in a bit. Wants, like, what do you want out of the relationship? That could be things like, do you want a sexual relationship? Do you want romantic activities with that? Like, what are some just like general things that you would like to get out of that relationship? And then talk about kind of like what your expectations are. I think a lot of times we go into relationships expecting that everyone's expectations within a relationship are going to be the same as ours, or that our partner can read our mind, and that is just not the case. So some examples of things could be like, do you expect to have like anniversary celebrations or like gifts with those, or like having that be a big aspect of your relationship? Do you expect like a hug from your partner every time you see that? Do you expect them to like send you a good morning text every day? Are you expecting them to like be able to call in emergency situations for you, even if it's like 3 a.m.? Like, what are some of the different expectations that you have? And like, okay, how is that working with your partners? How are you going to find ways to make this work and make that clear that that's something that's really important to you, and talk about why it's important to you? So I think sometimes like we might, like I might want a good morning text from my partner every day, and I have like this particular reason being behind why that is an important thing to me. But if them sending that doesn't actually meet that need, or doesn't meet what I'm needing out of that, that can sometimes be not helpful, and it can kind of hurt the relationship. So I feel like it's so important to also talk about like, okay, why do I need this reassurance? Why do I need this specific thing? Why is this so important to me? And kind of like, how can we make sure that we're meeting that? And if my partner can't meet that particular expectation, is there other ways that they can? Like, if you need a particular thing from your partner to feel reassured that that's not something that they can do, what are some other things that they can do that you've agreed on that would help meet that? And then also just talking about like some of your goals, different things like that. How do your goals line up with one another? How do they not? And just know that, like, again, not all meaningful relationships last forever. And really, like, how much do you want that to define whether or not you should enter a relationship with someone? Okay. I'm gonna talk about this in a sec. I just need to charge my laptop for a sec. Okay, so another big area of communication when you're defining a relationship is talking about cheating. So cheating can happen in any kind of relationship structure, regardless of whether it's like monogamous or non-monogamous. And one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that while there are like cultural standards around what cheating is, different people define cheating differently. So it's really important to define with your partner what that looks like. I know I've interacted with some people in like non-monogamous ways that were in monogamous relationships and define cheating in ways that probably differ from their partner. They had to have those conversations. Like, for example, some men I've interacted with are like, oh, well, any kind of sexual activity other than penile vaginal intercourse isn't cheating. And it's like, well, I'm not sure if that is the case with your partner. Have you talked to them about it? Have they actually defined it that way? So, like, what other things might we not necessarily count as cheating? Like, then there goes into the debate of things like, oh, well, porn isn't cheating. Well, if your partner defines it that way, then it is. It is just like, are we having these dialogues with our partner? So, different people are going to define cheating differently. So, again, keep that in mind. And really, anything that crosses your partner's boundaries on what constitutes cheating is cheating, regardless of how you view it. So, even if you're like, that's not cheating, like, again, respect that, respect your partner's boundaries. If that doesn't work for you, then that relationship probably needs to end. It's just not respectful of you to cross your partner's boundaries when they've already expressed that. Obviously, like, there are going to be certain things when you're defining cheating that are going to be more or less reasonable, but I'll talk about that in just a sec. But overall, like, how you define cheating should freely be discussed, freely be revised, as like people's boundaries can change. They might think, oh, I thought that was going to work, but it really isn't for me, or things like that. Or maybe new things come up. But I know, like, my partner will check with me on things that they aren't sure if it fits into cheating or not, and we do just sit down and have new frequent discussions about it. Okay. So, defining cheating. It can be different from partner to partners. If you're polyamorous like me, you might have different definitions with different partners on different things that fit this within your relationship. These should obviously be realistic things, things that can be controlled. So, like, experiencing attraction to other people, finding other people attractive, things like that are not really something your partner can control. But, saying things like, hey, you can experience that, but I don't want to hear about it, or like, please don't flirt with other people when I'm around, or even if you don't care if they do when you're not around, like having those kinds of discussions. I know one thing that was really interesting was there was this one study done about where they'd ask people in relationships, like, is it cheating if your partner fantasizes about someone else during sex? And a lot of them were like, yes, that is cheating. But as soon as it was them, they didn't see it as cheating. So really, whatever your definition should be, it should be mutual. If it's cheating for your partner to do it, then it should be cheating for you to do it. And it needs to be mutually reciprocal, just like kind of recognizing that. And it should be healthy. Like, we're not controlling anyone's behavior, controlling their lives. Like, things like, oh, you can't have any male friends is like not super healthy because you shouldn't be limiting the people they're interacting with or their friendships. Like, it should just be more like specific behaviors that affect the relationship rather than potentials for them seeing other people in other ways, things like that. So some examples of things, like there might be certain sexual activities or sensual activities that are off limits. Like maybe, obviously, like for some people, it is you can't have sex with anyone other than me. That's cheating. Or for me, it's like I don't really care who my partner sees sexually, but it's like sensual activities are really near and dear to me. So I'm like, I don't mind if you cuddle one of your other partners, if you like cuddle friends, but I don't feel comfortable saying that. Like that is uncomfortable for me. Or even just like having like a cuddle buddy that's like non-sexual is something that me and my partner have laid out. It might be certain romantic or platonic activities. Maybe you have a show that you watch together that if they watch it with someone else, that's cheating because that's your special time together, things like that. Some people define things like watching porn as cheating. And some people are just like, you know what, you can do whatever, you just have to communicate with me. So sometimes if you choose just not to communicate with your partner about what's going on, about that you are seeing other people sexually, you are doing these other things with other people, that can also constitute cheating. So it might also just define on the level of communication. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about navigating healthy breakups or navigating like breakups in general. There are lots of great resources for this that I'll mention some in a bit when I get to resources, but just general polite and healthy ways of navigating relationships, like breakups, like communicating face to face. Some big do's and don'ts, like definitely talk about it, definitely recognize like the good from the relationship, definitely do it in like a private space and make it clear that the relationship is ending, or if you're the one now initiating the breakup. Don't like ghost people, don't talk shit about your partner, like it's just like you like we're obsessed with this person a bit ago. I know for me, if I hear someone talking negatively about their ex, I won't have a relationship with them because I don't want to interact with someone that is going to talk about me like that at some point, whether or not we're friends, whether or not we're partners. I just know that that behavior is going to show up that way later on, and that's not something I want in my life. Um, Making sure that we're like not doing anything to get back at anyone, things like that. We're getting some space, and just modeling healthy breakups. So, like just like with relationships in general, like for example, ghosting people's really common. And I know for me, I make a big effort that if I'm going to unintentionally or intentionally ghost someone, or if I'm considering it, that I have a conversation with them like, hey, this isn't working. I just want to give you a heads up. Like, we're going to actually have a conversation about it. Maybe we're going to de escalate the relationship. Maybe we're going to do something else. But I just try and actually have that conversation like, hey, if that's just like, I don't want to ever have contact with you again, I'm going to be clear. I'm going to be clear about why. And I'm going to have that conversation, because if we're not modeling those kinds of behaviors, how can we expect them from other people? Even though it can be really difficult, really uncomfortable, I think it's so important to be having these conversations. And so just trying to model that, in my opinion, is important. Similarly with de-escalating. So de-escalating isn't necessarily always a breakup. It's just kind of moving down that relationship escalator. So things like, if you find out you're not really compatible to live together, just moving out, maybe still maintaining that relationship. Maybe you de-escalate into a non-sexual relationship. Maybe you are no longer dating, things like that. Just figuring out how you can de-escalate, that can always be a great option for some people. They aren't comfortable de-escalating a relationship, and that's totally valid. But I think that's just another option that a lot of people don't consider, like how can we maybe rework this relationship into something that is going to work. Making sure that we're refiguring out our boundaries with people, we're having those conversations, and that we're kind of trying to maintain healthy relationships with our exes if we're choosing to continue to interact with them. So another question I had in person was about like what to do if a friend's ex is like hanging around and enacting like relationship type behaviors if they chose to stay friends. So if someone's de-escalated into a friendship after a relationship, it's really important to have some space after that to kind of talk about what those new boundaries look like. Obviously, if the other person's not comfortable enacting like relationship type behaviors with them, like having like that conversation, setting that boundary. If people can't respect that boundary, maybe it is considering that maybe that interaction doesn't need to end. But truthfully, having conversations, trying to specifically define that, being like, okay, this isn't cool with me anymore, things like that. And obviously, if someone is like kind of like within that case, I did talk a little bit about like what can get into stalking behaviors, as well be that like online or in person, or just like showing up places that they wouldn't normally just to see that person. Like that is something that is reportable as well, and that should be treated seriously. So some basic communication tips. A lot of these are probably things you've heard before, but like using I language. So sometimes the word choice we use can imply things that we don't mean. So it is so important that we're saying things like I feel really this way when this happened, like, and then figuring out with your partner rather than, oh, you always do this or you never do this. Like that just can get really accusatory. So you want to make sure that we're kind of using that I language to show some personal responsibility, willingness to work with the other person. Even if we do feel like they are at fault, it makes people a lot more reciprocal when we're not approaching them in that way. So engaging in mindful listening. So when we're listening to people that we're not focused in on our own thoughts, not focused on our next response, we're just there in the moment, we're listening, we're asking questions to understand their experience. And then once we've fully gotten their perspective, then we can respond. Being honest, honesty is the key to a healthy relationships. Please, please, please just be honest. There's not really any reason to like lie to your partners. And then when we're apologizing to people, that we are just doing things to either make it up to them or we're showing how we're going to change our behavior, because an apology without anything really to follow it is pretty empty and isn't really an apology. So perception checking is a communication skill I learned in interpersonal communications a few semesters back. And this is one of my favorite communication skills that I learned. So this is for like if you are like looking at a situation and your like framing of it can get really catastrophic, really over the top, or just like not really understanding the other person's perspective and we're making assumptions. Like we use this to talk with people to kind of check our perspective, kind of check with them and clarify situations. So what you would do is you would one, describe some of the observed behavior. You're going to offer at least two explanations, because like one, maybe your like interpretation of the situation, maybe an other alternative explanation that might be the actual case, and you're going to ask for clarification. So an example would be like if I had a friend that like wasn't really responding to my messages, I could be like, hey, I noticed you haven't been super responsive to my messages. Is that because you've been really busy, or did I maybe do something that like upset you? Like, can you clarify what's going on for me? And that can kind of just help to be like, here's what I've been noticing. Here are some of my thoughts on it. Here's some other things I'm considering. And just like opening them up to kind of talk about that. Sometimes it might be something like we would have never even thought of. Sometimes it might be really difficult to take that truth, but it is such a great tool that I feel like can be used to kind of help us navigate those types of situations where we might not understand the full picture. But I know some things that I've done with me then to kind of navigate some of that is work with people on solutions. Like with one of my friends, we have a little agreement where if one of us is in a place where we can't respond, we've agreed that we'll send the other like a little cake emoji that's just like, hey, I saw your message. I'm just like not emotionally in a place to respond, or I'm busy right now. And I'll respond as soon as I can. And they'll send one back, and I just like won't open it so that I know like, okay, I still have to get to this at some point. This is what this is. But I got that idea from, I think, a book I read, something that was used a little asterisk. But I don't know, there are lots of different things that we can figure out in all these different types of situations. Another big thing when it comes to communication is advice giving. Like, don't give unasked for advice unless someone has specifically ask for advice, it's not really our place to give it. When we give people unasked for advice, what we are doing is we're communicating that we don't trust them to make their own decisions. We don't trust them to be like qualified to understand their own situation or figure out their own problems. So what we should be doing instead is asking questions to kind of get a better understanding of their experience, as well as maybe to help guide them to their own solutions. So these are the back pocket questions, which my interpersonal communications instructor shared with us to just kind of like, I just pull these up sometimes when people are in a situation or having conversation where it might be kind of one of those advice giving situations. And instead I try to use these as much as I can to just kind of help guide them. So things like, hey, what's that like for you? Or what are you willing or not willing to do? Or like, what do you think this registers? Is this for you? Or what are you hopeful for? Or like, what would this look like if nothing changes? Like, and it's been really spectacular to see how much it really does help to kind of guide people through that and just kind of see them come to those own conclusions. Like, oh, actually, like, I think this is what's going to work for me. Or I hadn't thought about this. Or now that I think about it, it's just really, really wonderful. But this is something that I feel like comes up a lot. I know one of my partners we've had a lot of discussion about, please don't give me unasked for advice. This is what that communicates to me. And then I definitely kind of myself have to check myself on the same, be like, okay, I'm sorry, I keep giving you advice when you clearly don't want it and it's unintentional on my part, and I'll watch on that. So here is, again, that resolving conflict that I mentioned. This is a little graphic that was in that same interpersonal communications class where we talked about kind of the different solutions you can come to. So you can have like pick one or either or your side, and that's like a win-lose solution, or you can just side with your partner and it's a lose-win solution, or you can find a compromise, which is a lose-lose, which was really interesting, but I'll talk about that in a sec. Or then like you can work together to find a solution that is going to address both sides of the conflict without anyone compromising, without giving in to the other side necessarily, which has been really interesting. I've actually been exploring this more with public speaking recently with the class I've been doing. But I am going to pull up some of those questions from before to talk a little bit about that, which I realized I did accidentally skip some of these questions, but I will get to them after this, I think. So that example of the partner who they feel less attracted to their partner now that their partners stop their transition process and is less feminine presenting and doesn't really want to pressure them to transition. So this little segment would be like their partner starts transitioning again, they're like dressing in feminine ways, they're taking hormones again, that now they're attracted to them more. Like that would be a win for them, maybe a lose for their partner if that's not something they're comfortable or ready for or wanting in their life. On the other side, things stay as they are. They don't talk to their partner just is wherever they're at in their progress, and they just are still not feeling that attraction, still not figuring out what's going on. That's kind of that lose-win situation. So they could come to some sort of compromise, and like some of these things that might be compromises might be some people's solutions. Like it really just depends, but that can be things like for example, maybe their partner does a full social transition, doesn't necessarily start taking hormones. Maybe they feel a little more attracted to that, but it still doesn't necessarily resolve the problem per se. But now they also feel forced to like dress in a certain way or kind of pursue this transition that might not be what they want. But instead they could work out some sort of solution. Maybe that is just like they do some little like feminine things with their appearance here and there, or they talk about other ways that they can kind of foster that, or what does that, how can they kind of help to create that without necessarily requiring anyone to change anything about themselves. Similarly, like with the example of a sex repulsed asexual in a relationship with an allosexual person, like for their solution, it could just be like, you know what, like things just stay as they are, like there's no sexual relationship, we don't try and address this need at all, this is my boundaries, this is how this is going to be. Their partner's needs might not necessarily be met. Lose-win situation, they have sexual relationship with their partner, they're not happy with it, they don't like it, super sexual pulse, not helping them at all, doesn't really like crosses their boundaries a lot, but doesn't but meets their partner's needs maybe. An example of a lose-lose with this, with a compromise, could be like we engage in like sexual activities like once a month, and that could be like, okay, this crosses this boundary, I don't love it, but then, and it's like, yes, it's not all the time, but it's still maybe not what that person wants. And then for the partner, it still might not necessarily be like what they were looking for, especially if their partner's not enjoying it. Similarly, like you could agree to like open up the relationship, and it's like, yes, this individual doesn't necessarily have to engage with the sexual relationship with their partner, but at the same time, they might not necessarily want an open relationship, and the other partner maybe it meets those sexual needs, but maybe that the issue isn't so much sex, but more wanting that connection with their partner. So instead, they could find ways to talk about that. Okay, like what are our needs? What do I really want out of this? Why is this important to me? And like, what am I maybe willing to compromise? So like that could just be like, what are some other ways we could connect that are sexual for my partner that aren't sex per se? Like, I know I was talking with someone the other day that quoted something about like, oh, when my partner goes and gets me coffee, that's sex for me. Like what are some things for you, that partner that kind of meet that emotional need or the connectional need that comes with that, and that works for them, that also isn't going to cross their partner's boundaries, that allows whatever the underlying need with those is. Yeah. So making requests for yourself. Okay. So when we're making requests for ourselves, they should be specific. They should just just be specific with what you want. Use I statements again. Avoid hinting at things. Instead, be really direct when we're expressing a need or a desire. So it can be as simple as like, hey, I would really like it if we did this thing. Like, what do you think? Like, how are we opening up that dialogue? But yeah. And then when we're expressing complaints, we're going to kind of use those same things, but we're going to temper it a little bit with praise. So this could be either around like something that's dysphoric or something you like to decrease or avoid, or just things that you dislike. But again, similar to before, tempering it with a little praise. So one example would be like, hey, I really like it when you do this thing, but it would be even better for me if we tried this. Like, what do you think? And when we're, rather than just like outright expressing that complaint, we should be offering some sort of suggestion. Like if we did less of this, if we maybe tried this, or things like that. Like maybe that complaint is, I wish you would do this thing. Like just like suggest doing that thing. Like it would be even better for me if we tried this. Like what is your thoughts on that? Because we definitely want to still be reading our partner's boundaries, reading what they're comfortable with, etc. So one thing that's really important as we're expressing our needs and complaints is to kind of have some self-knowledge in order to really communicate with our partners what our needs and desires and boundaries are within sexual interaction. It's really important for us to work on our sexual intelligence. So learning and accessing resources where we can, exploring new things with our partners as we're comfortable, of course, and then doing some self-exploration, like always putting a plug in for masturbation, self-stimulation, exploring even just like touch in non-sexual ways with ourselves, like exploring the ways that we maybe talk to ourselves, things like that. Just like how do we get a better understanding of ourselves? Because when we get those understandings on our own, it's easier to kind of implement that with our partner. Like, hey, this is something that's really been working for me. How can we implement this? So then on the other hand, when we are responding to requests and complaints from our partners, we want to make sure that we're asking clarifying questions, that we're focusing less on maybe personal failures and more on like what future changes can we make, what future successes can we have, because we want to continue having these dialogues. And yes, sometimes it can be hurtful to process that maybe something we did wasn't enjoyable, especially with like all these cultural standards and high expectations for performance within sexual interactions. But really, like our partners are communicating these things because they want to have more meaningful sexual interactions with us, or interactions with us in general, regardless of whether this communication is around sex or a relationship or anything else. And then making sure that we're thanking our partner for expressing their needs and boundaries. Like, hey, I'm glad you feel comfortable telling me that. So we can continue to have this dialogue. And it helps us know that, if our partners are like uncomfortable with something or don't like something, that they'll tell us, and that we can trust that we'll be having those conversations, and that when they tell us they do enjoy it, something that it is fully honest. So if communication is kind of uncomfortable or you're interacting with someone new, I really enjoy this activity that I came up with like one of my partners called, I just call it like 5 things. So each partner shares 5 things. And when we share these 5 things, there's like no pressure to do any of them. And the category is like you can do all 5 in one of these, you can do a mix of them, things like that. But includes things like things I enjoy or things I dislike, things I want to try, as well as like what are some boundaries. So I might sit down and just be just like go over like here's something I enjoy, here's one thing I actually dislike, I actually really want to try this thing. Just so you know, I do have this boundary around this, and I also really want to try this. Like it I like it because it allows me to like each time we're going to share something new, you're going to learn new things about me with each interaction. It allows me to learn more about my partners and share about myself in a more low-key pace where we're going to remember those things a little easier and where we can maybe talk about incorporating them, but there's still no pressure to. Like I could be like, I really like this, but I don't really want to do this today. So, or like, I really, really, really want to try this, but I have a few things I need to work through before I feel comfortable reaching that stage. Where I dislike this thing generally, but this is actually something I'm kind of interested in exploring today. But I did want to make it clear that I don't enjoy this thing, and in the future, maybe we avoid this if it doesn't work out. Or like I have this boundary, and here are some other areas that that this is off limits. But yeah, because you can do this both like with sexual interactions, but without it involving sex in general. This could just be like, here are some hobbies I enjoy. Here are like some like foods I dislike. Here's like an activity, or like I've always really wanted to like do this, or like here are my boundaries around like my cookware, things like that. Okay. So I did have a question that was about what resources are available in Logan. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of cover that with this. I was excited to see that because that is something I talked a little bit about. But first of all, just finding credible information in general. Always fact check everything, like look at individuals' credibility. Even like no one's an expert is something that I hear a lot from people that even I would consider experts. And it is just like, you know what, regardless of whether or not you feel like someone has authority, you still should fact check everything. I definitely encourage you to just like fact check anything that I share today. Do your own research. I really just like to do this as like a starting point, and because I feel like this kind of information should be freely available to people. So that's just part of why I enjoy this, because I do feel like there are so many like prices on information around navigating healthy relationships and getting sex ed information. Like I'm retaking human sexuality in the fall. There are so many prerequisites for that class, and I took it in concurrent enrollment at high school like several years ago, and it's like this should be freely accessible information to people, even if it is like a class and it is like work. Also like just applying the same things that we're taught about, looking for any other credible information, like honestly like types of sources and whatnot. And definitely like be aware of things like, books can be a great resource, but anyone can self-publish. Research papers can be great, but there can always be some bias with that. Articles, social media, etc. Like there's just so many open areas for bias and for lack of credibility that just always to be aware and to do your own research. So some USU available resources. Since I talked about communication skills, I definitely recommend this interpersonal communications course. I've taken marriage and family relationships. It's a good class. I like it. I feel like it was a little meta-normative and mononormative, but it was worth it. And it talks a lot about like navigating like family structures and relationships, and it was really great. Human sexuality is great. I haven't taken it here yet, but I've taken it at other institutions and heard about other institutions' human sexuality classes. So definitely one of my top recommendations of classes that I think everyone needs to take. And I do wish we had better sex ed programs at high schools that really did cover a lot of that information. Some online resources that USU has is like we have a page from Healthy Relationships Utah. You can also follow their social media, their Instagram. IU Wellness has a bit about sexual and relationship wellness. Savvy Office is a great resource, not even just for like sexual violence types of situations, but they do have a sexuality educator
Erica Jensen, who's really great. I have absolutely loved interacting with her. She's fun to talk to about these topics. Savvy's Instagram, great resource. But yeah, and they also have just like lots of resources on their website as well, and they post tons of stuff about not just sexual violence but healthy relationships and resources. Office of Equity is great for sexual violence type situations, understanding like navigating unhealthy or abusive relationships, getting resources, understanding your legal rights, things like that. Student Health and Wellness Center, great information for like more technical information. They have STI testing you can always talk to your doctor about, things like that there. CAP's a great resource for navigating like healthy relationships with like a therapist or whatnot. And the Inclusion Center Library has lots of great resources and books that are freely available. I definitely recommend that. And then some community resources. These are just more like for like sexual violence types of situations because I do work some with the Office of Equity. So CAPSA is a lot like Savvy, but it's off campus and a great resource in Logan. And the Cache Valley Hospital is the only hospital around here that does sexual assault forensic exams, which they also do general medical care too. So just another great resource. And there's lots of resources outside of Logan too, but I don't know as much about them. So just some other suggestions for like, if you're looking for more like technical health related questions, like your healthcare provider is great. The BDSM community and resources from them are really great for navigating like consent and boundary related info. Since again, they are kind of like start of that. And then the polygrammers and E&M community and resources put out by them are some of the best like health relationship information, even if you're navigating a monogamous relationship or identify as monogamous, things like that. And then social media. So some other outlets that I recommend. We have like the Planned Parenthood. I love their Instagram. Your Diagnosed Nonsense is Diag Nonsense is a great one from a sex therapist who I adore his work. Ask Educator is a sexuality educator whose page I love. These other ones are more polyamorous resources. And Mistress Link is a sex worker advocacy group that I love their stuff and just navigating healthy interactions with sex workers, which is really big to me. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about just arousal, like the components behind it, about like kind of what it looks like. Just pretty briefly, just to kind of, because some of this I just feel like is important to have an understanding of. And yeah, and then I'm going to take a quick break to respond to something. But so arousal is divided into physiological arousal and psychological arousal. So like your body's physiological process of becoming aroused, as well as like being psychologically aroused. And then like when you feel emotionally and psychologically aroused. But the main thing to keep in mind is that these are two separate systems. So physiological arousal happens in response to sex-related stimuli, and then psychological arousal is just when you yourself are aroused by something and like just like emotionally. I don't know. I feel like Emily Nagotsky, a sexuality educator, explains it really well and like a lot better. But she kind of talks about arousal non-concordance, which is when these two types of arousal don't line up. So you can be physiologically aroused, not psychologically aroused, as well as psychologically aroused, not physiologically aroused. So that could be things like, for the first one, that's things like maybe getting an erection without like any like context around it, or like if someone experiences an orgasm during an experience of sexual assault, like big trigger, but those are just some of them, just bigger examples. Psychological arousal is things like if you're really enjoying a sexual interaction, really getting a lot out of it, but you can't get hard, you can't get wet, things like that. But that can be really difficult for like some people explaining to their partners. So I feel like having this understanding of arousal in this way is so important. And I really do just like to pass on this information that there are just like so many things that go into this. And yes, you can do things to kind of help yourself to kind of by combining sexual stimuli with things that you're psychologically aroused by to kind of create some of that physiological arousal and kind of condition that, but not so much the other way around. Like we can't necessarily control our physiological arousal responses. Those are involuntary. I think one of the things that's always really interesting to talk to people about is thinking about sex as like trying to achieve orgasm on both sides, which isn't necessarily always everyone's goal. Like there's so much more that we can get out of sexual interactions, like connection and maybe like getting into like a subspace, getting into like all these different things that can be different individual goals. So it's always interesting talking with people and being like, yeah, I'm not really interested in orgasming within this particular situation. And some of that might just be like, I don't need that to feel satisfied. Like these are the things that I enjoy that don't lead me to that I'd like to do today. Or sometimes it's like, I don't like that experience because I feel like I'm out of control of my body and I don't want that with this individual, things like that. So just having communication about that and like rather than doing things like faking orgasms that we're being like, you know what, I'm not gonna orgasm from this, but I'm having a really great time, or like, hey, I'm just about to be done, like to wrap up, like, what about you? Things like that. But just expressing that we're still enjoying ourselves if we are. And it's so, so important that we're listening to our partner's voice rather than physiological cues. So one other thing that I like to touch on just from when I take human sexuality is kind of some of the common reasonings behind a lot of sexual disorders. I do think there are obviously like some things that are within like the DSM-5 that shouldn't be like lacking sexual desire is not necessarily abnormal and is really just like exclusive of asexual experiences. So just and people that just, don't necessarily want a sexual interaction in their life. Like that's not, there's nothing wrong with those individuals. But I do feel like others that can show up like similarly that maybe people do actually have desire to change rather than just like cultural pressure to fit into this specific mold can like are still normal experiences. It's still good to understand them, but a lot of the reasons behind them tend to be things like medication is a big one. A lot of times, sex therapists and doctors will look at like medications people are on that could cause certain issues that individuals are having. A lot of it has to do with poor sex education, and a lot of it has to do with different cultural ideas and myths. So, like for example, like performance anxiety brought on by cultural myths around like what normal sex is and like what your partner's expectations are and things like that that can kind of come into that and be a big thing behind that. So another reason why I think it is so important to learn more about our sexuality, learn more about sex, like have better education programs, and kind of also like help us to break down a lot of those different ideas and myths that we're taught growing up and that we're exposed to through things like media and our peers. And then again, always talking with our doctors when problems arise and we're like, hey, like this is what I'm experiencing. This is kind of like what I'm hoping to change. Like, can you help me figure out what's going on here? Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about sexual behaviors. I'm not going to talk about this too much because it does vary a ton for different people and like what actually is sex. So back when I took human sexuality, the like scientific community that's like around this field generally defines it as like a broad category of like sexual activities other than coitus, so other than penile vaginal intercourse, to kind of be more inclusive of so much more around that, because that's generally what we think of when we hear the word sex, but it is so like exclusive of queer identities and queer experiences and necessarily the kinds of sexual interactions that everyone wants for whatever their relationship is, because like there's not like any standard sexual type of behavior that is going to be liked by everyone. So it really is hard to define what these interactions are going to look like, especially by like one particular behavior. So there are a lot of strong cultural ideas around like what normal sex is, but again, there's not really anything that's normal so much as just like stuff that's going to be safe and consensual and things that are a little more like standardly perceived as sex, but everyone's going to be different. So like someone's sexual interactions might include coitus, it might include anal, it might include oral, it might include all of the above or none of the above. It could include lots of different things. It can be like it could be entirely like non-sexual BDSM, and that's what sex is for that individual. Like there's so many different things that it can look like that it is really hard to define. But I do think one thing that I forgot to touch on earlier when I was talking about STI protection is like the types of behaviors you're engaging in are going to obviously affect the kind of safer practices that you do. So I did have one question from someone that just was asking about, like, can you talk about protection for lesbian slash female ex-female sex? So protection in general, like you're going to use it for things like vaginal intercourse, anal intercourse, oral sex. You can use it when you use toys on your partner or yourself, even if it's just only toys that you use and only on yourself. You can use it over your hand if you're like fingering or fisting or whatever you might be doing. Like there's just lots of other things you can use and lots of other tools and resources available as well. I do really I feel like Planned Parenthood has had some really good posts, particularly on this, even if it's not like explicitly like this is for like female sexual interactions. But I think that is a topic that isn't talked a ton about. The first time I'd had any discussion about protection with my like other AFAB partners was getting an STI test with like a doctor that was like kind of her specialization. And she's like, oh, and with your female partners, this is what you can do. And I was like, oh, well, no one's ever shared that information with me. And it's interesting how much it goes like just like forgotten about and how it doesn't get talked about. But generally, like again, like for oral, for things like that, there are other tools and things available. But I can try and plug those in at the end, or if people have other questions, I can answer them later on if that doesn't kind of answer the question. So then similarly, like understanding things like so erogenous zones, so like mouth, chest, genitals, other areas that are naturally more aroused on the human body, but like exploring outside of that with things like sensate focus, which is used a lot in sex therapy for different types of disorders. But that would just be like kind of like exploring outside that area, exploring areas of the body that aren't necessarily sexualized. So yeah, I'll talk more about that kind of later on in a bit when I get into gender affirming sex. I have some stories, but yeah. So now we're getting into gender affirming sex. So this is again so important because all of us have gender. It's going to interact all of our sexual experiences. So I made this little graphic that just is kind of like how we experience and perform gender during sex is affected by a lot of different things. It's affected by our sex assigned at birth, our sexual romantic and relationship orientation, or other orientations. It's affected by cultural ideas of normal sex, or cultural gender norms, our gender identity, gender expression, our personal individual characteristics, all kind of overlap to demonstrate how we experience and perform our gender during sex. So some just general things like one, don't assume what kind of activities are going to be pleasurable or affirming or desired for someone based off of their sex, gender identity, gender expression, or any other identity factor, as well as don't assume what's not going to be enjoyed by someone. You'd be really surprised. I know some examples, like for me, a lot of that has been like because I'm AFAB, people make assumptions that certain activities are going to be more enjoyed for me. So like, oh, I'm gonna try and like stimulate your clitoris, or I'm gonna give you oral sex, and it's like, actually, I don't really like these things in this way, or things like that. Trying to have communication about like what that actually looks like for you. And then similarly, I had one partner who had recently discovered that they had really sensitive thighs, that they really enjoyed having their thighs stimulated during sexual activity. And they just were like, how is it in all these years of my life that no one has ever touched my thighs during sex? And I was like, well, did they know you were gender fluid? No. Did they know that you were pansexual? No. I'm like, well, they thought you were a cisgendered heterosexual individual, and they were making assumptions that like, oh, I can't do that because that's probably going to be like emasculating, things like that can come up. So making sure that we're not making assumptions that someone's going to enjoy something or going to not enjoy something based off of how they identify or how we perceive their identities. So just being aware of that. Secondly, like just share how you want to be treated in a sexual interaction that is gender affirming for you. So it's a little easier for other people when we ask these kinds of questions and we start by sharing what it is for us, because then they get an idea of what we're asking for and it gives them a little more time to think about it than when we just put them on the spot. And it's a lot easier when it's mutual. So like if someone's like cisgendered and they're asking their trans partner how to make it gender affirming for them, it can be really dysphoric maybe if they're not talking about how it can be gender affirming for them within their identity, because it's like, oh, well, you're only asking me because I'm trans or non-binary or because of those things. And it makes it hard to kind of maybe feel seen past that. But obviously it's going to vary from person to person still. not all trans and non-gender conforming people experience dysphoria during sex or even at all. So it is just like, how are we having these conversations in ways that are mutual? And then we're going to be asking questions about how to make sex gender affirming for our partner. So then once we've kind of shared our side, it's like, okay, how can I help you? So again, ask, don't assume. Instead, you can say things like, hey, what kinds of things make you dysphoric? Or hey, what can I do to make this a more gender affirming like activity for you? We want to be identifying dysphoria, identifying triggers, and creating a plan. So like identify specific words, acts, types of touch, etc., that elicit dysphoria or other triggers in general within sex. And we want to say a safe word for when those things come up. And then if any kind of dysphoria triggers come up, that we're gonna probably take a break. Maybe we get back to that interaction later, or maybe we just finish up for the day, that kind of thing. So yeah. And then we want to be exploring sex in ways that avoid dysphoria. So this could be avoiding touch outside of major erogenous zones, things that people might have a little more gender dysphoria around, and then just like exploring things around areas that maybe are not so typical, like elbows, thighs, like ears, like eyelids. I don't know, like whatever works for you, whatever you're interested in exploring, like without going straight for those erogenous zones. Because I think a lot of times we're taught to kind of engage with erogenous zones because we're taught that that's going to be pleasurable for a partner rather than thinking about, okay, maybe how do I want to touch you, things like that. And also sometimes seeing certain parts of someone's body can make them really dysphoric. So we want to be like talking about that, and that could be things like maybe a partner only gets partially undressed, or maybe they don't get undressed at all, and we kind of just like explore touch like underneath clothes, like with things on, like that can be really fun. It can get pretty creative, but that is something that I was recommended while working for my presentation on gender affirming sex that I thought was really interesting and really interesting to explore. So then involving gender affirming items and activities. So sometimes, like rather than focusing so much on avoiding dysphoria, we can focus on creating gender euphoria for our partners. So that could be using like gender affirming toys. So for example, there are like dildos built for like trans mass bodies, or maybe we're engaging with activities that help build euphoria. I know one example I was given was like role play. You know exactly like what to expect. You can kind of role play in a way that can be really gender affirming, things like that, or that maybe avoids gendering at all. But overall, we just want to be, again, kind of doing that same conflict resolution thing where we're working with our partner to think creatively about sex in ways that are affirming to how they identify, that step outside of those gender norms and cultural scripts for them. So sometimes sex can stay the same. It's just the word choice that we use that needs to change. So this can be just like maybe the pronouns we use for our partners. This could be the words we use to label our partners, such as like girl and bee, androgyne, boy, etc. The compliments that we give our partners, and the ways we label our partner's body, which we already kind of talked a little bit about, that we're asking what kinds of compliments our partners like. We're asking how they want us to label their body. We're asking about pronouns. We're asking about maybe how they want us to label them. I know like sometimes my partner will make assumptions, like I said I use they them pronouns today, and then they said, oh, you're such like a pretty NB, and I was like, oh, I'm not non-binary today, like that's not gender affirming for me. It's like, so making sure that we're still like not just having conversations about pronouns, but if you're going to use a label, asking what label they would prefer, even if that's not them telling you exactly what their gender identity is that day. So now we're going to talk pretty briefly about navigating sexual violence in a relationship, be this a friend, a partner, a family member, or ourselves. So first of all, like responding to a survivor, whether or not this is within a relationship or outside. Sexual violence is going to impact different people differently. Different people are going to have different symptoms that can vary pretty dramatically. So for example, some people might start like falling behind at school due to an impact of sexual violence. Some people might start overachieving. Some people might respond by like completely like avoiding sexual interactions for forever or for a long time or for whatever, while other people might like suddenly start having lots and lots of sex with their partner, or just like in general our partner. Like different people respond differently, and even from instance to instance. So even individuals like myself who have had different experiences with sexual violence, like sometimes those symptoms afterwards can change with each instance too. So when we're responding to these people, that we're not asking why questions, especially since that can come off really much as victim blaming, and we're just kind of avoiding questions really. Like, instead, we can always say things like, hey, you can tell me as much or as little as you want, like trying to keep it in their control. And we don't want to pressure anyone to report or to seek help. And like, if they decline it, like you can still, and you like offer resources, like you can still be there for them. But these are generally individuals that have had lots of control taken out of their lives, and we don't want to be taking more away from them by pushing them to make certain decisions about their situations. So responding to a survivor, first, we're going to start by believing like, hey, I believe you, because unfortunately, a lot of times they are not believed. So we want to start by just making that clear. We're going to listen and affirm their experience, like it's not your fault. We're going to express empathy. I'm sorry this happened to you. And we're going to share resources, and it's going to be like on campus, off campus resources. It's going to just be like, hey, how can I support you? Things like that. So then navigating that within your relationship, if you or your partner are a survivor, so one, it is always the survivor's choice when they disclose experiences of trauma. Like, people aren't necessarily going to disclose that at the beginning of an interaction with a person on like a first date or who knows, like, and they might not bring it up in a relationship at all. So it's their choice whether or not they disclose that, and really just like setting boundaries around that, whatever they're comfortable with. But just discussing how to navigate triggers. So you can talk about triggers without necessarily sharing an experience with someone, just like what are maybe some environmental triggers, word choice triggers, activities that are triggering. So like I have different like food things in my environment that can be triggering, that I'm just gonna be like, hey, I'm gonna step out, rather than maybe someone like controlling what someone else is doing within that environment. But some things that I have like talked about with one of my partners is like word choice and things like, hey, don't say things like that I'm yours, or refer to any part of me as ours, or things like that. That like ownership type of thing can be big for me. Or like if my partner has said things like, oh, you're lucky I'm a virgin, or like things like that, that can be really, really triggering for individuals with experience of sexual violence. So making sure we're having that discussion on like, okay, how can I make you feel safe? How kind of activities can we avoid or engage in to help you navigate that? So last of all, we're talking a little bit about the BDSM, kink, and fetish community. Um, so just some basic terminology. We have things on a scale from like dom to sub. Some people are switches, which means they're both comfortable with dominating and being the submissive. And then similarly, there's top to bottom, versus a lot similar to switch, but it's typically used more within like the gay and lesbian community as like who's like top or bottom in regards to sexual interactions that are not necessarily kink. So just being aware of that. It's pretty interesting history looking at it, but I don't have a ton of time to go into that. Yeah, so BDSM, kinks, and fetishes. So BDSM stands for bondage/discipline, dominion/submission, and sadism/masochism. If you didn't know that already, you do now. Some kinks and fetishes can look like lots of different things. These could be like use of toys during sex. It could be role play, like taking on like, I don't know, different like profession roles. It could be like pet play. It can be like consensual non-consent. It can be lots of different things. Sensation play, so that could be like temperature play, food play. Could be like with like different items of things. Like there's so many different things that go into that, and it's fun. Humiliation, degradation, marking, display, objectification, even like praise, kinks, voice kinks, feet, bondage, breath play, knife play, hair pulling, impact play, group stuff, exhibitionism, overstim, denial. Like there's so many things that go into that. And what's kinky to some people or vanilla to others, like, but I think whatever individuals define as kinky for them is perfectly valid. Just having those conversations with your partner on like maybe the things that you're interested in as you're comfortable. Of course, like you don't have to disclose all your interest to your partner, and they don't always line up, but always, like, if your partner's not interested in engaging in BDSM, if you're not, that's perfectly valid, and no one should be coerced or pressured into that. But definitely just pulling up the first rule of the pervert club. So basically, like, your kink's not my kink, and that's okay. So like, we're respectfully responding to other people's interests, that like, you know what, I might not be into that, but your experience is valid, and you know, it's okay that I'm not. But again, it should be consensual, like when we're engaging with kinks with other people, that everyone is consenting. We're kind of following the same conversation on consent and boundaries. And you know what? Everything in fantasy is okay. It's just sometimes some things that come out of fantasy are not always consensual. And you know, some things a lot of people do find are just better in fantasy than they are in practice. So that's been interesting to explore some work by a few different educators around that. So I really like the chocolate and peanut butter analogy, which if you're not aware, it's like basically it's considering like that people are going to have different likes and dislikes when it comes to BDSM and sex. Some people like sex, but not BDSM. Some people like BDSM, but not sex. Some people like both, but don't necessarily want them together. Or maybe some people like both and always want them together. Or maybe like things like that. So like some people like chocolate, some don't. Some people like peanut butter, some don't. Some people like both, some like only one. And some people who like both like them together while others don't. So just kind of keeping that in mind on people's preferences are going to vary, and that's perfectly valid. But yeah, no, love that. So when we're talking about kinks, we're going to be avoiding kink shaming people. Instead of they're going to say things like, hey, just, you know, this is out of bounds for me, or I want you to avoid this, without being like, oh, I just really hate this, or like, I'm so grossed out by this, or things like that. Because we want to be respectful of our partner's kinks, especially if we might not be aware if they like or dislike something. Two people can be into the same thing and like it in completely different ways. So I do think it is so important to, like, if someone shares a kink that they like, or that they want to try, like to ask about like how they like it, like what specific ways do you want to engage in this, like what is it that you want to get out of this? Because like if I'm engaging in one kink because of like one reason and someone's engaging it for another reason, we might not necessarily be super compatible in the ways we navigate that without having a conversation about that. So like what is that kink about for you? For example, like I will share why I like a certain kink and what I want out of it when I engage with it when I'm talking about it with someone else. And that's going to be different for everyone, but I do just like to kind of be like, hey, this is why I'm interested in this. And this is kind of what I want to get out of this. But yeah, so engaging in a scene, like if you're completely new to it or you're trying something new, definitely practice something that you feel safe and comfortable with, especially with communicating openly with. Um, I'm just gonna go briefly over like what a scene looks like, but there's tons of great resources just on like BDSM Wiki. It's a great resource. I definitely would recommend checking it out if you're completely new to the kink scene. But definitely do all your research before you try something new, especially if there are like risks associated with it. So when you're doing a scene, there's that negotiation phase. You're gonna do kind of like a self check on yourself. You're gonna vet your partner, kind of maybe see how they interact with other people, see how they handle different situations. If you're in like at like a kink party, things like that, or whatnot, you're going to talk through a scene beforehand, exactly like what's going to happen and exactly like what it looks like. You're going to have a conversation about boundaries and consent. So you're going to be using a sort of speech, kind of just like expressing like, hey, I need this. I have this boundary. I'm not okay with this. Sending a safe word and a nonverbal one if you need it, or just like even if you don't think you'll need it, just like having it just in case so that it's clear in there. But generally, you should be talking about the scene so in detail that you know exactly what might come up, what is going to happen, what's going to be said, things like that. Then once you've had all this negotiation phase, you're going to have like the scene, and then afterwards we have aftercare, which should be negotiated before the scene. That can look like lots of different things. That could just be like, you know, cuddling for a bed, or maybe you have some sort of like activity, or like there's just like lots of different ways that people can navigate that. And again, BDSM Wiki, a great resource for if you're trying to find more information or trying to get connected with those resources. So actually like shopping for like cute things or just like in general. So for like toys, equipment, costumes, even things like lingerie and whatnot, even if you aren't into super into like BDSM per se, like sex shops are great. Etsy is great. Definitely always read reviews, of course. There are lots of really great online shops. I don't really have any recommendations, but I know in Logan, I really love the Red Fox just for like toys and cute lingerie and like sex ed books. They don't have a great big kink collection, which I don't love, but they do have a few things out there for people that are exploring. A lot of BDSM events are invite only. but there are other ones that you can get in for free. Just check out like fetlife.com for more like community within the BDSM community, as well as just like to find like a local scene, maybe get to a free one, find some people there, get invited to something if you find it's working for you. But yeah, so I did just want to wrap up. I did have one more question I didn't get to that I meant to get to over the like when we talked about like romantic orientations and aspec identities, but someone just asked, how do I find meaningful romantic relationships as with people as a demi-romantic? I've always struggled with dating in general, but as I've grown up and my social environments have drastically changed, I'm not sure how to navigate dating as someone who doesn't develop romantic feelings until a bond has been created, but still craves those relationships. Any advice or tips on communicating my demi-romanticism or what approach I should take to meeting new people? So I think just like again, having those conversations up front. I have a lot of demi-romantic friends that are also kind of figuring this out, and I'm identify as aromantic with some demi in there, but I don't have this problem in the same way. So it is just like being upfront with people like, hey, this is what my experience is. Like, this is what I would like to do to maybe kind of help get to that stage, but this is what my needs are. This is what my boundaries are. I think a lot of that is just going to take a lot of self-work on like defining like, okay, what kind of interactions are okay with me at this stage? What is working for me? What do I need to maybe get to this place, even if it's like I'm not sure if I'm going to develop these feelings for this person, but I'd like to try something. Then it is just like, okay, we're gonna sit down, maybe like write some things out, figure out what those boundaries are, and then still put yourself in that place to meet there. Be like clear that maybe that's something you'd like to discuss before interacting, maybe set out a few specific needs or boundaries on like if you're doing like online dating, like on like profiles and whatnot, or just like as you meet new people, if you're interested in being like, hey, I'm interested in you, but like here's kind of what this is going to look like for me. It doesn't have to be like super in depth, super like here's what my entire experience is, but just like here's some of my needs. But yeah, so thank you all so much for watching this. If you want to get in touch with me again, here's my Insta right now and my email that I will try to respond to. But yeah, definitely if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out. If you have anything you learn that you find fascinating, definitely like send it my way. I'll probably fact check everything you send me, of course, but like I would love to learn whenever I can from you. Or if you have anything that I did that was not the most inclusive, definitely let me know so I can learn from you and I can kind of get a better idea. But yeah, thank you so much.